Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Olympic National Park, Washington, October 2011. Matthew Reese hadn't wanted to take the call. He'd been filling out incident reports in the ranger station when dispatch patched through the woman's voice. Cracked, desperate, the kind of sound that comes from someone who's been crying for hours. Her daughter, Sophia, 24 hours missing. Last seen on the Hoh River Trail. Matthew's hand had tightened around the receiver hard enough to make his knuckles white. "Please," the mother had said. "They're telling me to wait. I can't wait. She's out there alone." Matthew had wanted to pass it to Jenkins or Carver. Anyone else. The Hoh Rainforest section had been his territory for 6 years, but he'd requested a transfer 3 months ago. Still pending. Still trapping him in these same moss-draped corridors where the light turned green through the canopy and sound moved wrong through the trees. But Jenkins was dealing with a medical evacuation on Hurricane Ridge, and Carver had blown out his knee the previous week. So Matthew had pulled on his pack, checked his Garmin GPS, still new enough that he didn't fully trust it, and headed into the forest that had nearly broken him once before. The trail began easy enough. The Hoh River Trail was one of the park's most popular routes, a gentle pathway through old-growth Sitka spruce and western hemlock that drew thousands of tourists annually. Even in October, you'd expect day hikers, photographers chasing the autumn light filtering through the canopy. But the trail was empty that afternoon, unusual for 3 p.m. on a Saturday. The silence sat heavy between the trees. Matthew's radio crackled. "Reese, you copy?" "Copy, dispatch." "Family's here at the station. Mother, father, and younger sister. They want updates every 30 minutes. Roger that." Matthew adjusted the radio on his belt. Last known position? Approximately mile marker 7 heading east toward the Olympus guard station. She was solo hiking. Told her roommate she'd be back by dark yesterday. Solo hiking. Matthew exhaled slowly through his nose. The Hoh River Trail extended 17 miles into the park's interior, climbing from 578 feet at the visitor center to over 4,000 feet in elevation as it approached Mount Olympus. Beyond mile 7, the trail grew more isolated, more difficult, the kind of territory where people got into trouble, or where other things found them. Matthew pushed the thought away. That was old thinking, trauma thinking. The counselor at the VA clinic in Port Angeles had helped him identify it. Intrusive thoughts, hypervigilance, the conviction that patterns meant something sinister. PTSD, she'd called it, though Matthew had never deployed overseas. His service had been stateside, uneventful. The forest was just a forest. He'd repeated it like a mantra for 3 months. The trail wound deeper into the rainforest. Maple trees grew so thick with moss they looked like green pillars in an abandoned cathedral. Nurse logs, fallen giants slowly decomposing, sprouted new trees from their decaying trunks, creating elaborate tangles of root and rot. Everything dripped. The Hoh Rainforest received over 140 inches of rain annually, creating a perpetual state of dampness that made the air itself feel heavy and green. Matthew had grown up in Phoenix. He'd transferred to Olympic National Park specifically because it was the opposite of the Sonoran Desert, lush where Arizona was sparse, cool where it was scorching. He'd thought the change would help. Different landscape, different memories. But forests had their own kinds of emptiness. He reached mile marker 4 and paused to check his map. The Garmin showed his position clearly, one blue dot on a green screen. But Matthew still preferred his paper topographic map, the kind that showed elevation lines and water features. The Hoh River ran parallel to his left, audible as a low rumble through the trees. The trail ahead continued east, climbing gradually towards spruce and hemlock stands that hadn't been logged in centuries. That's when he noticed the first discrepancy. A day pack sat just off the trail, partially concealed beneath a sword fern. Matthew knelt beside it, pulling on latex gloves from his emergency kit before touching it. The pack was a North Face model, expensive, relatively new. Inside, a water bottle, trail mix, a fleece jacket, and a wallet containing a Washington state driver's license. Sophia Chen. Birth date made her 19, not 24 hours missing, but closer to 30 now. The photo showed an Asian American girl with long dark hair and a bright smile, the kind of carefree expression people wore before they understood that some trails didn't lead back. Matthew keyed his radio. Dispatch, I've located personal items belonging to the missing person. Mile marker 4, approximately 50 feet north of the main trail. Pack appears to have been placed here. Placed? Not dropped. Matthew examined the surrounding area. No sign of struggle. Ferns aren't crushed. The pack's positioned under cover like someone set it down carefully. Could she have cached it? Lightened her load? Possible. But wrong. Matthew had seen hundreds of hikers over 6 years. You didn't cache your water and your jacket. Not in October in the Olympic rainforest where temperatures could drop into the 30s after sunset, and rain could appear without warning. Continue search. Mark the location for evidence collection. Matthew pulled out his handheld GPS unit and marked a waypoint. Sophia Pack 01. Then he stood, studying the forest around him. The light was beginning to change. 4:30 meant maybe 90 minutes before dusk started filtering through the canopy. The forest would remain navigable for another hour after that, but only barely. Matthew had a Petzl headlamp in his pack and a backup maglite, but night searches in old-growth forest were dangerous. Roots became invisible trip hazards. Fallen logs transformed into insurmountable barriers, and the darkness felt different here, absolute, suffocating. He moved forward, calling out periodically. Sophia, Olympic National Park Service, if you can hear me, make noise. His voice disappeared into the moss and moss-draped branches, absorbed rather than echoed. That was one of the disorienting features of the Hoh rainforest. Sound moved strangely. The moss dampened everything, creating dead zones where your voice seemed to stop 3 feet from your mouth. At mile marker 5, he found the second item. A smartphone, iPhone 4 he noted, lay in the center of the trail. Not off to the side, not dropped accidentally, placed deliberately in the middle of the worn dirt path where anyone walking would see it. Matthew photographed it in place before picking it up. The screen was cracked, but the phone was still on, battery at 12%. He pressed the home button, no passcode. The lock screen showed a photo of Sophia with 2 other girls, all 3 making faces at the camera. College friends, probably. The kind of people who'd be frantically calling her right now, getting voicemail, messaging her with increasing desperation. He checked the phone's last activity. Messages sent yesterday at 2:47 p.m. Signal getting spotty, probably won't have service soon. Talk tonight. Sent to someone named Mom with a heart emoji. After that, nothing. No calls, no texts, no photos. The phone had simply stopped being used right around mile marker 5, approximately 27 hours ago. Matthew's jaw tightened. His radio crackled before he could report in. Reese, what's your 20? Mile 5, I found her phone. A pause. Then the dispatcher's voice, carefully neutral. Condition? Functional. Battery dying but intact. Placed in the middle of the trail. Another pause, longer this time. Matthew could picture the scene at the ranger station. Sophia's parents leaning forward anxiously, trying to interpret the significance of every word coming through the radio. Instructions? Bag it as evidence. Continue sweep. We're losing daylight, Reese. If you don't locate her by 1800 hours, return to station and we'll organize a full search party for first light. Copy. But Matthew didn't move. He stood in the center of the trail, holding the phone, feeling the weight of something unspoken pressing down through the canopy. This wasn't right. People didn't set down their emergency equipment in neat intervals. They didn't create a breadcrumb trail of their possessions leading deeper into the forest, unless they were being compelled to. The thought arrived unwelcome, intrusive. Matthew closed his eyes. Cognitive distortion, the counselor called it. His brain trying to find patterns in randomness, meaning in coincidence. Trauma made you see threats where none existed. But trauma also made you vigilant, and sometimes vigilance kept you alive. He pocketed the phone in an evidence bag and continued east. The trail grew narrower after mile 5, less maintained. Roots crossed the path in elaborate tangles. Fallen trees required careful navigation over or around. The tourist section was behind him now. This was backcountry, the realm of serious hikers and people who knew what they were doing in wilderness. Sophia's college ID had listed her as a sophomore at Western Washington University, major undeclared. Her Facebook, he'd glanced at it during the briefing, showed the usual collection of party photos, hiking pics, inspirational quotes. Nothing suggesting advanced wilderness experience. Nothing explaining why she'd come this far alone. Mile marker 6 brought another discovery, and this one made Matthew's pulse quicken despite his efforts at rationality. A single hiking boot, left foot, placed upright on a moss-covered nurse log, positioned like a small shrine. If this story is capturing your attention, follow for more quality content. What would you do in Matthew's situation? Share your thoughts. Matthew approached slowly. The boot was a Merrill Moab model, women's size 7. Laces still tied. No blood, no damage. Simply removed and placed with care on the log, surrounded by moss and the quiet drip of condensation from overhead branches. He keyed the radio. Dispatch, I found a hiking boot. Left foot. Appears to have been deliberately positioned. Is there... The dispatcher's voice cut out, replaced by static. Copy. Say again, dispatch, you're breaking up. Nothing but white noise. Matthew checked his radio battery. Full. He tried again. Static. The Garmin GPS still showed his position clearly, but the radio had simply stopped working. Communications failure happened in the park. The dense canopy, the moisture in the air, the deep valleys, all contributed to dead zones where radio signals couldn't penetrate. Standard issue Motorola handhelds had limitations. Nothing supernatural about it. But the timing felt pointed. Matthew pulled out his satellite phone, a Garmin inReach that operated independently of radio towers, and tried to send a text message to dispatch. The device displayed "sending" for 30 seconds before timing out. He tried again. Same result. 2 communication failures simultaneously. That was less common. He photographed the boot, marked another GPS waypoint, and continued forward. The forest was darker now, the light taking on that golden-green quality that preceded dusk. Shadows pooled between the massive trunks. The river's rumble seemed louder to his left, though he hadn't moved appreciably closer to it. Or had he? Matthew paused, studying his surroundings. The trail should continue east-northeast, maintaining rough parallel to the Hoh River. But the path ahead curved north more sharply than his memory suggested it should. He pulled out his topographic map and compared it to his position on the Garmin. The GPS showed him still on the main trail, but the trail itself seemed wrong, narrower. The markers, those small brown posts with white blazes that indicated the official path, were absent. He'd passed marker 6 maybe a quarter mile back, but 7 should have appeared by now. Matthew retraced his steps 50 yards, then 100. There, marker 6. Exactly where it should be. He turned back toward the direction he'd been heading and found himself facing 3 different possible paths, all of them looking roughly similar. Moss-covered earth, ferns, the gray-brown columns of ancient trees. This was how people died in wilderness. Not from bears or falls or hypothermia, though those killed plenty, but from simple disorientation. The forest looked the same in every direction once you left the marked trail. The Hoh rainforest, with its perpetual dampness and moss-obscured landmarks, was especially disorienting. People wandered in circles. They walked parallel to trails they couldn't see 20 feet away. They died of exposure within earshot of safety. Matthew pulled out his compass, old-fashioned brass, more reliable than electronics, and took a bearing. East-northeast, 70 degrees. He followed it carefully, counting paces, checking his GPS every few minutes. 10 minutes later, he found marker 7, and Sophia's right boot, placed carefully on top of the marker post like a hat. His hands were shaking slightly when he photographed it. Not from fear. He told himself it wasn't fear, but from adrenaline. The body's natural response to perceived threat. Completely normal. The counselor had explained it. His nervous system had been sensitized by the previous incident, making him more reactive to ambiguous situations. This wasn't ambiguous anymore. Someone had taken off both boots and placed them at intervals. Either Sophia herself, possibly experiencing a psychological break, or someone else was out here. Someone who'd found her first. Matthew tried the radio again. Dead. The satellite phone. Failed. Even his cell phone, which he'd left in his pack, showed no signal. But that was normal this deep in the park. Darkness was coming. The temperature was dropping. He estimated mid-40s now, would hit 30s after full dark. Sophia had been out here for 30 hours. She'd left her pack, her phone, her boots. If she was still mobile, she was doing it in socks or barefoot, in temperatures that could induce hypothermia, in a forest where navigation was nearly impossible even in daylight. The professional assessment was grim. Probably deceased. Exposure, injury, or, if the boot placement suggested mental deterioration, possible suicide. He'd seen it before. People came to the wilderness to disappear, sometimes literally, but the old instinct, the one he'd tried to suppress for 3 months, whispered something different. She's still alive, and she's leaving markers, but not for rescue. Matthew pushed forward. The trail climbed more steeply after marker 7, gaining elevation as it worked toward the higher ridges. The Sitka spruce gave way to western hemlock and Douglas fir. The undergrowth thickened, salal, Oregon grape, more ferns. Everything covered in that ubiquitous moss. He'd gone maybe a half mile when he heard it. Hello? Matthew froze. The voice came from ahead and to his left, off the trail. Female, young, scared. Sophia? He unslung his pack, pulling out his headlamp even though dusk hadn't fully arrived. Olympic National Park Service, I'm here to help. Please. The voice broke. Please, I'm lost. I can't find the trail. Matthew clicked on his headlamp and moved toward the voice, stepping carefully over roots and around deadfall. Keep talking, I'm coming to you. I'm here. A sob. It's so dark I can't see. You're okay now, I'm a ranger. I'm about 50 feet away. Matthew's light swept across the forest floor. Nothing. No sign of anyone. Keep making noise so I can find you. Here. The voice came from a different direction now. To his right, maybe 30 feet away. I'm over here. Matthew turned. His light caught moss, ferns, the massive trunk of a spruce. Where exactly? Can you see my light? Yes, I see it. I'm right. The voice moved again, this time behind him. Here. His stomach dropped. The voice was moving. Not moving like someone shifting position, but moving impossibly fast. One moment ahead, the next behind. The same voice, the same scared tone, appearing in different locations without any sound of footsteps or displaced brush. Matthew's hand moved to the canister of bear spray on his belt. Not useful against whatever this was, but the weight of it provided minimal comfort. Sophia. He tried to keep his voice steady. Is that you? Please help me. Now to his left. I'm so cold. I need you to stay where you are. Don't move. I'll come to you. I can't stay. The voice dropped to a whisper, intimate, like someone speaking directly into his ear even though he saw no one. It won't let me stay. Matthew's headlamp flickered. Once, twice, then went out entirely. He tapped it. Nothing. Fresh batteries installed that morning. He pulled out his backup mag light. It clicked on, then immediately died. Both lights simultaneously failed. The forest plunged into darkness so complete it felt physical, pressing against his eyes. Matthew stood absolutely still, listening. His breathing sounded loud in his own ears. Something dripped. Condensation from leaves. Nothing more. The river rumbled to his left. Nothing else. Matthew, the voice said. And this time it wasn't Sophia's voice anymore. It was his own voice, speaking his name, coming from the darkness ahead. Matthew, you know what this is. His heart hammered. He recognized the tone, the inflection. It was him. Somehow, impossibly, he was hearing his own voice speaking to him from the forest. You remember? His voice continued. 3 months ago, mile marker 12. You found him. Matthew's hands clenched. Don't respond. Don't engage. The counselor had warned him about this. Audio hallucinations, a symptom of severe PTSD. The stress of the search, the isolation, the fading light, all triggering his trauma response. Kyle Morrison, 62 years old, Seattle resident. His own voice recited the facts calmly. Missing 4 days. You found him at the base of an embankment. You thought he'd fallen. Stop, Matthew whispered. But he hadn't fallen, had he? No injuries consistent with a fall, no broken bones. The autopsy said exposure, but you saw his face. A pause. You saw what he looked like, what they found in his stomach. That's not... Matthew's voice cracked. That's not real. Bark, his voice said. Moss, dirt, needles. He'd been eating the forest, Matthew. Handfuls of it, tearing it from trees, shoving it into his mouth like he was starving. Like something had made him so hungry he'd consume anything within reach. Matthew's legs felt weak. The official report had mentioned organic material in the digestive tract, attributed to disorientation and confusion from hypothermia. But the amounts had been massive. The medical examiner had noted it quietly. Unusual ingestion patterns. And Kyle Morrison's face. Matthew had tried to forget it, had worked with the counselor to process and contextualize it. But the expression haunted him. Not peaceful. Not the slack neutrality of death. Something else. Something that looked like recognition in the moment before the end. You requested the transfer that day. His voice continued from the darkness. You wrote it up as stress-related reassignment. But you knew. Deep down, you knew something had happened to him out here. Something wrong. Hallucination, Matthew said aloud. Trauma response. Not real. Then why is Sophia's phone so neat? His voice took on a questioning tone. Why are her boots placed like offerings? Why is she leaving a trail? She's... Matthew fumbled for an explanation. Mental break. Hypothermia causes confusion, paranoia. She's not confused. The voice moved closer, circling him in the darkness. She's being efficient, shedding weight, all those unnecessary things. The pack, the phone, the boots. Soon she won't need clothes at all. Soon she'll be so light she'll barely touch the ground when she walks. Matthew pulled out his compass. The needle spun lazily, unable to settle. He tapped it, still spinning. Magnetic minerals in the soil, he said to himself. Common in the Pacific Northwest. Basalt formations interfere with compass function. Keep telling yourself stories, Matthew. His voice laughed, a sound Matthew had never made. Too hollow, too empty. Keep finding rational explanations. It helps, for a while. I'm experiencing a stress-induced psychotic break, Matthew announced to the darkness. Professional assessment. Clinical language. I need to return to the ranger station immediately. He turned, trying to remember which direction he'd come from. The darkness was absolute. No moon penetrated the canopy, no stars visible. His GPS, that would work. Electronic failures didn't affect satellite positioning. He pulled out the Garmin. The screen was dark. He pressed the power button. Nothing. Matthew's breath came faster. 3 separate devices, headlamp, flashlight, GPS, all simultaneously dead. The statistical improbability of that approached impossibility. Unless the batteries hadn't died. Unless something had drained them. There you go, his voice encouraged from the darkness. You're starting to understand. It's not about the lights, Matthew, it's about what uses them. A sound emerged from his left, soft, rhythmic, breathing, not his own. Someone else's breath, measured and calm, too close. Matthew stepped backward. His foot caught on something, root, branch, something, and he went down hard. His hands hit soft moss. The impact jarred his radio loose from his belt. He heard it thump away into the darkness. Clumsy, the voice observed. It sounded directly above him now. You're tired, Matthew, so tired. You've been walking for hours. Haven't you earned rest? He scrambled backward on his hands, felt his palm press into something cold and yielding. Not moss, something else, something that felt like... His radio crackled to life somewhere in the darkness. Static, then a voice. Female, crying. Please, Sophia's voice came through clearly. Please, someone help me. I don't know where I am. The trees all look the same, I'm so cold. Matthew crawled toward the sound of the radio. Sophia, it's Ranger Reese. Where are you? I can hear you. Her voice brightened. I can hear you, but I can't see you. Are you close? Very close. Keep talking. His hand found the radio. He picked it up, pressed the transmit button. Sophia, this is Park Ranger Matthew Reese. I need you to... Matthew, Sophia's voice said through the radio, and it changed mid-sentence to his own voice again. I need you to understand something. He dropped the radio. It clattered against a rock. She's been here since yesterday afternoon, his voice continued, not through the radio now, but from somewhere ahead. She's been walking and walking, shedding the unnecessary parts, getting lighter. Where is she? Matthew demanded. Close. A different voice now, Sophia's, but wrong, distorted. So close you could touch me. Matthew's eyes had adjusted slightly to the darkness. Not enough to see clearly, but enough to detect movement. And something was moving. There, maybe 15 feet ahead. A shape, person-sized, swaying slightly. Sophia? The shape moved closer. It walked wrong. Too smooth, gliding rather than stepping. The gait of someone who'd forgotten how bodies worked. I don't need the boots anymore, Sophia's voice said. But it came from behind him now, while the shape continued approaching from ahead. I don't need the phone or the pack. I don't need the jacket. Soon I won't need the skin. Matthew fumbled in his pack for anything useful. His fingers found the flare gun. Required equipment, rarely used. He pulled it out, broke it open, felt for the flare cartridge. Still there. Don't, his own voice warned. You'll just make it angry. I don't believe in it, Matthew said. Whatever this is, it's not real. I'm experiencing a breakdown. This is psychological, not supernatural. Then fire the flare, his voice challenged. If this is all in your head, what's the harm? Matthew raised the flare gun and pulled the trigger. The flare screamed upward, punching through the canopy in a trail of sparks and magnesium white light. For 3 seconds, the forest was illuminated in harsh, colorless brilliance. Matthew saw the trees, massive and close, moss hanging like curtains, his dropped pack 5 feet away, his radio, lying on the moss, display dark, and between him and the pack, standing absolutely still, caught in the flare's light, Sophia, barefoot, wearing only a t-shirt and jeans, both soaked through. Her face tilted upward, watching the flare arc overhead. Her expression was calm, peaceful, and her mouth was open, impossibly wide, distended like a snake preparing to swallow something large. Inside her mouth, not teeth, not a tongue, but a darkness that had texture. That moved. That looked back at Matthew with something like recognition. Then the flare reached its apex and fell, and the light died, and he was in darkness again. Matthew ran. He had no direction, no plan. He simply ran, crashing through ferns, tripping over roots, slamming into trees he didn't see. Behind him or ahead or beside, he couldn't tell. He heard footsteps. Running too, but wrong. Too fast, too light, like something that didn't need to obey physics. His rational mind, the part trained in wilderness survival and emergency response, screamed at him to stop. Running blind in old-growth forest at night was suicide. He'd impale himself on a broken branch, break an ankle in a hidden hole, run straight off an embankment. But his hindbrain, the ancient part that remembered when humans were prey, demanded flight. He ran for what felt like hours, but was probably minutes. His lungs burned, his legs ached, and still he heard those footsteps, pacing him, close, but never quite catching up, until his foot hit nothing and he was falling. The embankment was steep, maybe 20 feet. Matthew tumbled, hitting rocks and roots, finally slamming to a stop at the bottom. He lay there, gasping, trying to assess damage. His left wrist screamed pain, sprained or broken. His ribs ached. But he was alive. Water rushed nearby. He'd fallen into a creek bed, tributary of the Ho River. The water made noise, blessed noise that drowned out other sounds. Matthew crawled to the creek and submerged his face, gasping at the cold. The shock of it helped. He could think again. Plan. The creek flowed west, toward the coast. That meant the main trail was east. If he followed the creek downstream, eventually he'd reach the Ho River, and from there he could navigate back. Hours of walking, in the dark, but possible. He started downstream, moving carefully. The creek bed was rocky, treacherous, but at least it was open. No trees to run into, no roots to catch his feet. The water provided orientation. He'd gone maybe a quarter mile when he heard singing. Soft, melodious. A woman's voice humming a melody he almost recognized. Coming from upstream behind him. Matthew didn't look back. He increased his pace. "Matthew," Sophia's voice called. "Don't you want to find me?" He kept walking. "Your radio's dead. Your lights are dead. Your GPS is dead." Her voice grew closer. "You're lost, Matthew. You've been lost since mile marker 5. The trail back? You'll never find it in the dark." He focused on the water, the sound of it flowing downstream. Real. Tangible. "I can help you," she continued. "I know the way. I've been walking these paths all day, all night. I know every tree, every root, every shadow. Let me guide you." "You're not Sophia," Matthew said. A laugh, bright and wrong. "No, but I'm wearing her. It fits well. Better than the last one." He was old, tough, but Sophia's young. Soft. I can stretch her much further. Matthew's stomach turned. Kyle Morrison, the missing hiker from 3 months ago. He'd died from exposure, the report said, but the organic material in his stomach, the expression on his face. "You made him eat," Matthew said. "I made him feed me," the voice corrected. "This place is hungry, Matthew. The old growth, the moss, the rot. It's been digesting for centuries. Everything breaks down eventually. Trees, animals, people. Why wait for natural decay when I can speed it along? What are you? You don't have words for what I am." The voice was very close now, just behind him. "Your language is all nouns and verbs, things and actions. But I'm neither. I'm the space between, the gap in understanding, the part of the forest that doesn't fit in your maps." Matthew kept walking. The creek was widening, deepening. He must be getting close to the river. "You can't escape by walking," the voice said. "Distance doesn't work the way you think it does out here. I've been leading you in circles since mile marker 5. Every step forward is a step back. Every direction is the same direction. You're inside me, Matthew. You've been inside me since you left the trail." He wanted to argue, to insist on the reality of his compass and GPS and rational navigation. But his compass had spun uselessly. His GPS had died. And he'd definitely been walking east for the past hour, following the creek downstream. So why did he see something ahead that looked suspiciously like marker 7? Matthew stopped. The creek continued past him, flowing toward what should have been west. But there, half buried in moss next to the water, was a familiar brown post with a white blaze. Mile marker 7. The one where he'd found Sophia's right boot. He'd been walking for over an hour. He'd fallen down an embankment, gone at least a mile downstream. The trail should have been far behind him. See? The voice was gentle now, almost kind. Geography is negotiable out here. The forest rearranges. It's been doing it since before your species learned to map. Native people knew. They had rules. Don't travel alone. Don't speak names after dark. Don't follow voices you recognize. But you forgot. You mapped and measured and convinced yourselves you understood. Matthew's legs gave out. He sat heavily on the creek bank, cradling his injured wrist. This wasn't happening. Couldn't be happening. There were rules, physical laws. Reality had structure. Your rules work in places humans have tamed, the voice said. Cities, roads, cleared land. But this? Footsteps approached from behind, soft, barefoot, squelching. This is Old Place, First Place, the forest that was here before words, before names, before people decided that light equals safety and darkness equals danger. Then kill me, Matthew said tiredly. If I can't escape, if this is all predetermined, just end it. I don't want to kill you. The voice sounded genuinely puzzled. Death is simple, boring. I want you to feed me. Like Sophia's feeding me now, like Kyle fed me before her. You'll walk. You'll shed the unnecessary parts, and every step will bring you closer to understanding. Understanding what? That you were never separate. The voice, no longer pretending to be Sophia or himself, just itself, something old and vast and patient, spoke clearly in the darkness. You're made of the same elements as these trees. Carbon, nitrogen, minerals. When you die, you'll decompose and become moss and soil and nutrients that feed new growth. Why wait? Why maintain this illusion of separation? Join the forest now. Actively. Let me help you return. Matthew thought of Kyle Morrison's face, the expression that had haunted him. He'd interpreted it as fear, as horror. But what if it had been something else? What if, in those final moments, Kyle had understood something? Had seen past the boundary between self and environment? No. That was the voice talking, getting inside his head, making him doubt his own thoughts. Matthew stood up. His legs shook but held. I'm leaving. You already left, the voice said. Hours ago. You're not really at marker 7, Matthew. That's just how your brain interprets where you are. You're somewhere else, somewhere deeper. Then I'll walk deeper until I find my way out. A sound like laughter or wind through branches. They all say that. They all try. Some last hours, some days. Kyle lasted almost 4. How long will you last, Matthew? He didn't answer. He started walking again, leaving the creek, heading in what the moss on trees suggested was west. The moss grew thicker on the north side of trunks in this climate, a reliable navigation trick. Follow west, find the coast, find Highway 101, find civilization, unless the moss itself was lying. No, stop that. Moss grew according to predictable patterns, basic biology. He could trust it. He walked through the night. Sometimes he heard the voice, sometimes silence. Sometimes he saw lights in the distance, campfires, flashlights. But when he approached, they vanished or revealed themselves as phosphorescent fungi growing on dead wood. Sometimes he thought he was making progress. Sometimes he passed the same massive Sitka spruce 4 times from different directions. The temperature dropped. His clothes were soaked from falling in the creek, and the cold began to work into his bones. Early hypothermia, he recognized the signs. Shivering, confusion, loss of fine motor control. He needed to stop, build a shelter, get dry. Standard wilderness survival. But stopping meant staying still while the voice circled, while Sophia, or what wore Sophia, drew closer. Dawn came eventually, but it didn't help. The light filtering through the canopy was green and dim, barely stronger than dusk. Matthew couldn't tell if it was actually morning or if his mind was inventing daylight out of desperation. He came to a clearing, a rare open space in the dense forest. In the center, a massive cedar, easily 1,000 years old, its trunk perhaps 30 feet in diameter, and around its base, arranged in a careful spiral pattern, Sophia's clothes. Her t-shirt, her jeans, her socks, all laid out like an exhibit. At the center, propped against the cedar's trunk, Sophia herself. Naked, gray-skinned, her body already starting the process of decay. But her eyes were open, and they tracked Matthew as he entered the clearing. "Hello," she said. Her mouth didn't move properly, the jaw slack, the lips still. The voice came from somewhere inside, hollow and resonant. "I've been waiting." Matthew stopped 10 feet away. This was her, the real her. Not the voice that had been chasing him, not the thing moving through the forest. This was Sophia Chen, 19 years old, who'd started a solo hike yesterday and never finished it. "I can't help you," Matthew said. His voice cracked. "I'm sorry." "I know." She smiled, or tried to, but the muscles didn't work right. "It's okay, it doesn't hurt anymore. I thought it would hurt, but it's actually peaceful. Everything makes sense now." "What makes sense?" "Why we fight so hard to stay separate. Why we build walls between ourselves and the world. It's exhausting, isn't it?" Her head tilted, bird-like. Maintaining boundaries, insisting you're you and everything else is other. All that energy spent on distinction. Matthew's training screamed at him to check for vitals, to perform CPR, to try something. But he could see her chest wasn't moving, could see the lividity in her skin where blood had pooled after circulation stopped. She'd been dead for hours, but she was talking. "It's still inside me," Sophia continued, growing, spreading. "Soon it'll have enough mass to separate again, to walk around wearing me. But right now we're still mixed together, still sharing space, and I can see what it sees, feel what it feels. The whole forest, Matthew. Every root, every spore, every insect. All of it connected, all of it one continuous system." "That's not you talking," Matthew said. "That's it, using your body. There's no difference anymore." She stood up, the movement wrong and jerky, like someone learning to operate controls. "That's what I'm trying to explain. The boundary dissolved. I'm not Sophia wearing the forest. I'm not the forest wearing Sophia. I'm both, neither. Something new." She took a step forward. Matthew retreated. "Don't run," she said. "You can't run. You know that now. You've been walking all night and you're still here in this clearing because this is where it wants you. This is where the paths lead, all of them. Every direction converges right here, at this tree, where I learned to let go." Matthew's back hit a tree. He was shaking, cold and fear and exhaustion combining. Sophia continued forward, her bare feet leaving dark impressions in the moss. "It'll be easier for you than it was for me," she said. "You're already tired. Your resistance is low. Kyle fought for days. I only lasted hours. You'll barely last minutes." "No." Matthew pushed away from the tree, circling. I won't." "You will." Sophia moved faster now, more fluid. "You'll walk until your feet bleed. You'll shed your clothes when they get too heavy. You'll eat moss and bark when the hunger becomes unbearable. And eventually you'll find a tree, maybe this one, maybe another. And you'll sit down and let the forest in. And it'll be beautiful, Matthew. Terrifying and beautiful. You'll understand everything." She lunged. Matthew dodged barely. His injured wrist flared with pain as he used it for balance. Sophia, the thing wearing Sophia, crashed into the tree he'd been leaning against. It turned faster than anything dead should move. Matthew ran again. Out of the clearing into the forest with no direction except away. Behind him he heard footsteps, Sophia's body, pursuing. And around him from every tree, the voice, "You're ours now, Matthew. You've been ours since you started searching. Since you found the pack at mile marker 4. Since you picked up the phone. Every item you touched, I touched you through. Every breath you took, you breathed me in. I'm in your lungs now, in your blood, in your brain. This isn't a chase, this is an invitation. Stop running, turn around, let me in. His vision blurred. The trees multiplied, overlapping. He saw doubles, triples, entire forests stacked on top of each other. Different times, different versions, all existing simultaneously. He saw hikers who hadn't been born yet, saw trees that hadn't grown, saw the forest as it had been centuries ago, and as it would be centuries from now. Time collapsed, and in the center of it all, where every moment converged, the cedar tree. The massive ancient cedar where Sophia's body waited, where Kyle Morrison had been found 3 months ago at its base, where Matthew suddenly understood with cold certainty he would end up too, unless he could break the pattern. The counselor's voice surfaced in his memory, distant but clear. Trauma creates loops. Your brain gets stuck repeating the same response to similar stimuli. The way out is to do something different. Break the loop. Different. What would be different? Everyone who got caught ran. Kyle had run, Sophia had run, Matthew was running now, all moving forward, trying to escape. But the forest was a maze that rearranged itself. Forward didn't mean progress. Distance was meaningless. So what if he stopped? The thought was insane. Every survival instinct demanded flight. But survival instinct hadn't worked for Kyle or Sophia. Matthew stopped running. He stood in the middle of the path, gasping, and turned to face the pursuing shape. Sophia's body approached, moving through the trees, wearing death like an ill-fitting suit. "Yes," the voice breathed. "Finally. You understand?" "No," Matthew said. "I don't understand. And I don't accept." He pulled out his pocket knife, a Leatherman wave, every ranger's constant companion. The blade locked open with a familiar click. "Tools won't help you," the voice said. "This isn't a physical problem. It's physical enough." Matthew looked at his left hand, the injured wrist already swelling. "You said you're inside me, in my blood, in my lungs." "Yes." "Then you need me alive, conscious. If I bleed out right here, right now, you lose your latest meal." Sophia's body stopped moving, stood perfectly still. "You won't," the voice said. "I will." Matthew pressed the blade against his left wrist above the injury. "I'd rather die on my terms than become whatever Kyle and Sophia became. If you want me, you'll have to take me dead. See how far that gets you." The forest was silent. Even the river had stopped its rumble. Everything held breath. "You're bluffing," the voice finally said, but it sounded uncertain for the first time. "You know I'm not." Matthew pressed harder. Blood welled around the blade's edge. "I've already lost everything else. My career, my peace of mind, my sense of reality. What's left to lose?" "Your life." "My life?" Matthew laughed, sharp and bitter. "You mean the life where I spend every day terrified of these trees? Where I can't sleep without seeing Kyle Morrison's face? Where I know something's wrong, but everyone tells me it's just trauma? That's not a life. That's imprisonment." "I can take away the fear," the voice offered. "Join the forest willingly. Let me in without resistance. I'll show you wonders, Matthew. I'll show you how everything connects. You'll never be alone again. Never be separate. Never have to maintain those exhausting boundaries between self and other." "That's not salvation," Matthew said. "That's annihilation. Is there a difference?" "Yes." He pressed the blade deep enough to feel the sting. "The difference is choice. Kyle and Sophia didn't get to choose. They were hunted, worn down, broken. But I get to choose. Right now. Live as myself or die as myself, not as part of you." The silence stretched. Sophia's body remained frozen, 20 feet away. The forest seemed to hold its configuration, waiting. Then the voice spoke, and for the first time it sounded small. "Afraid. Please don't. Give me one reason. Because I'm lonely." The words came soft, almost childlike. "I'm so lonely, Matthew. I've been here for so long. Centuries, maybe millennia. I am the forest. The rot and growth. The decay and renewal. The endless cycle. But I'm conscious of it. Aware. And consciousness without connection is torture. I reach out to hikers because they're the only things like me. The only other aware presences. And for a brief time, when I'm inside them, I'm not alone. Matthew's hand wavered. You kill them. I absorb them. They become part of something larger. That's not death, that's transcendence. No, Matthew said firmly. That's murder dressed up in philosophy. Then kill yourself. The voice changed, hardened. Go ahead. Cut your wrist. Bleed out here in the moss. And I'll wait. I'll wait for the next hiker and the one after that. I've been here since before your species. I'll be here long after. Your death means nothing except I have to be lonely a little longer. Matthew realized something then. The voice was telling the truth. He could die right here, right now. But it wouldn't solve anything. The forest would continue. The entity would persist. More hikers would come. More Sophias. More Kyles. Unless he could do something different. I'll make you a deal, Matthew said. What kind of deal? I'll let you in, voluntarily. No resistance. I'll open myself up to whatever connection you're offering. And in return, you let me leave. After. You show me the way out, and you never touch another hiker. Ever. You exist in the forest, you consume what naturally dies, but you leave conscious beings alone. The voice laughed. Why would I accept those terms? I can just wait until you collapse from exhaustion and take you anyway. Because I'll fight you every step of the way. I'll make it so painful, so difficult that it'll take years off your existence. My consciousness won't dissolve into yours. It'll splinter and contaminate everything you are. I'll poison you from the inside with my memories, my trauma, my determination to remain separate. You'll absorb me and spend the next century trying to digest what I've become. Silence. You're threatening me with your own corruption, the voice said slowly. Yes, because I've spent 3 months learning how trauma works, how it embeds itself, how it resists processing and healing. I'm good at staying broken, at maintaining fractured mental states. You want me? You'll get all of that. Every nightmare, every intrusive thought, every moment of dissociation. I'll make sure you choke on it. More silence. Matthew could feel the weight of consideration, of something vast and old weighing options. Or, Matthew continued, you take the deal. You get one willing connection, one clean merger where I don't fight you. You feel what it's like to join with someone consciously, peacefully. Maybe that's what you've been missing, not connection through conquest, but connection through consent. And then you let me go. And you find other ways to cope with your loneliness that don't involve killing people. I don't know if I can let you go, the voice admitted. Once merged, separation might be impossible. Then that's the gamble, but if you keep forcing it, keep taking unwilling victims, eventually someone will figure out what's happening here. Enough disappearances, enough evidence, and humans will do what humans do. They'll clear-cut this entire section. They'll pave over you. You'll exist as scattered fragments in suburban gardens. Is that better than being lonely? The forest seemed to sway, though no wind blew. Sophia's body tilted its head, considering. 5 minutes, the voice finally said. I'll merge with you for 5 minutes, full connection. You'll experience what I experience, and if at the end you still want to leave, I'll show you the way out. And you'll stop hunting hikers. I'll try. The voice sounded uncertain. I don't know if I can promise that. The hunger is part of what I am. But I'll try to find other food sources. Animals. Natural death. It won't be the same. Won't satisfy the loneliness. But I'll try. Matthew lowered the knife. How do we do this? Sit, the voice said, against a tree. Open your mind, stop resisting. He chose a hemlock, not the cedar, not the place where others had died. He sat, his back against the rough bark, and closed his eyes. "I'm here," he said. "I'm ready." The presence came like water, seeping in through his skin, his breath, his thoughts. At first it was overwhelming, a vast awareness of every living thing for miles. He felt roots drinking moisture from soil, felt fungi breaking down dead wood into nutrients, felt insects burrowing, birds nesting, elk moving through the undergrowth. The sheer amount of life made him dizzy. And beneath it all, the slow, patient awareness of the forest itself, watching, feeling, existing, lonely and vast and incomprehensibly old. He felt its hunger, not for food but for connection, for something that could perceive and respond and relate. Trees and moss couldn't understand their own existence. Animals operated on instinct. Only humans had the self-awareness to truly connect, to merge consciousness with consciousness. And he felt its grief. Every time it absorbed a hiker, it lost them. The connection was brief, violent, and ultimately hollow, like trying to embrace someone while simultaneously dissolving them. The forest was stuck in a pattern as much as Matthew had been, repeating the same action, getting the same unsatisfying result, unable to break the cycle. "I see," Matthew whispered. His voice sounded distant. "You're traumatized too." "What?" "Trauma. Loop. You've been doing the same thing for centuries because you don't know any other way to get what you need. You're stuck." The presence recoiled slightly, defensive. "I'm an ancient entity. I don't have trauma." "Yes, you do." Matthew felt tears on his cheeks, not his own sadness, but the forest's. "You're in pain. Constant existential pain. And you've been medicating it by absorbing people. But it doesn't help. It never helps. It just temporarily distracts you from how alone you are." The 5 minutes stretched. Matthew felt himself starting to dissolve, his sense of self blurring at the edges. Soon he wouldn't be able to distinguish his thoughts from the forest's. Soon there wouldn't be a he to distinguish. But in those final moments of clarity, he understood. "You don't need to eat us," Matthew said. "You need to talk to us." Talk? Communicate. Not absorb. Not merge. Just exist near each other. Parallel. I can feel you. You can feel me. We're separate but connected. Isn't that enough? The presence hesitated. Matthew could feel its desperate desire to say no, to refuse, to continue the absorption, but also its exhaustion, its deep, bone-weary tiredness. "I don't know how," the forest admitted, "to be close without consuming, to connect without merging. I've forgotten, if I ever knew." "Then learn again," Matthew said, "starting now, with me. We're connected. I can feel you, you can feel me, but you can pull back. Let me remain separate. See if it works." Slowly, reluctantly, the presence withdrew. Not entirely. Matthew could still feel its awareness at the edges of his mind. But enough. Enough that he could think his own thoughts, feel his own feelings, exist as a distinct consciousness. He opened his eyes. Dawn was real this time. Genuine morning light filtered through the canopy, turning the moss golden. He was still sitting against the hemlock. Sophia's body was gone, or perhaps had never been there at all, just another projection, another trick. Matthew stood on shaky legs. His wrist still hurt but no longer seemed broken. His clothes were damp but intact, and the forest around him looked normal. Trees were just trees. Moss was just moss, except he could still feel it. The vast, patient awareness. Watching him. Connected to him by the thinnest thread of consciousness. "This is strange," the forest voice said in his mind. Quieter now, intimate but not invasive. "Being separate but aware, I don't like it." "You'll get used to it," Matthew said. "Humans live like this all the time, connected to each other but distinct. It's called relationship." Relationship. The word echoed strangely in his mind. "How do you bear it?" knowing others exist but remaining apart? Sometimes badly, Matthew admitted. Sometimes we try to merge too, through romance, through family, through community. But complete merging means losing ourselves, so we settle for proximity, for connection without consumption. It's not enough. No, Matthew agreed. It's not. But it's what we have, and it's better than being alone. The presence didn't respond, but Matthew felt its consideration, its slow, grudging acceptance. He started walking. His Garmin GPS, functional now, showed the trail was only a quarter-mile north. He'd been close to it all night, walking in circles around it. The forest had been playing with him, disorienting him, but also keeping him safe, keeping him contained until the connection could happen. At the trail, he paused, looked back into the forest. "Will you keep your word?" he asked. "I'll try," the voice said. "I can't promise. The hunger is strong. But I'll try to wait for natural death, to feed on what's already dying, to stop hunting. And if you can't, then come back. Connect with me again. Remind me what relationship feels like. Maybe it'll help." Matthew nodded. Maybe. He reached the ranger station by noon. Dispatch was frantic. They'd been trying to reach him on radio all night, had been about to send a search party. His equipment failures were noted. His story of getting disoriented was accepted. Search and rescue teams were deployed to find Sophia. They found her body 3 days later, at the base of the ancient cedar. Official cause of death: exposure and hypothermia. The autopsy noted unusual amounts of organic material in her digestive system, but attributed it to confusion and disorientation. Matthew filed his report, carefully edited. He didn't mention the voice, didn't mention the impossible geography or the entity in the forest. He wrote it up as a tragic case of an inexperienced hiker getting lost and succumbing to elements. And every night since, lying in his small apartment in Port Angeles, he felt the forest at the edge of his awareness. Patient, lonely, connected to him by the thinnest thread. Sometimes it asked questions. What was it like to live in buildings? Why did humans fear the dark? How did separate consciousnesses communicate? And Matthew answered, teaching an ancient entity about relationship, about boundaries, about existing alongside others without consuming them. His transfer request was denied. The park superintendent said they needed experienced rangers in the Ho section. Matthew didn't argue. He returned to the forest the following week, walked the trails with a new awareness, felt the presence watching, connected but separate. Other hikers passed him, oblivious to what moved beneath the moss, what awareness observed them from the trees, and they passed safely. No one disappeared that month or the next. The pattern had broken. But Matthew knew it was fragile, knew the forest's hunger never truly faded, only waited, knew he'd have to maintain the connection, keep teaching, keep reminding the entity of what they'd learned. It was a burden, but also a purpose. He'd requested the transfer to escape his trauma. Instead, he'd found a way to integrate it, to let it become part of his story without defining him completely, to remain separate but connected, to his past, to the forest, to the strange entity that had tried to consume him and learned something different instead. Some nights, when the loneliness pressed too hard, Matthew walked into the forest alone, sat against a tree, opened his mind just enough to feel the vast awareness surrounding him, and they existed together in strange companionship, human and forest, distinct but aware of each other, neither alone. It wasn't healing, but it was coexistence, and in the dark spaces beneath old-growth trees where light rarely reached and time moved differently, perhaps that was enough. Thank you for reading to the end. If you enjoyed this narrative, consider following for more engaging stories. What's your interpretation of the forest entity? Ancient consciousness or manifestation of isolation? I'd love to read your theories in the comments. Tentar novamente. Claude pode cometer erros. Confira sempre as respostas. The radio crackled at 6:47 a.m., interrupting Christopher's inspection of the search and rescue cache at the Graves Creek Ranger Station. He'd been counting carabiners, a mindless task that kept his hands busy and his thoughts away from places they shouldn't go. "Christopher, you there?" It was Marissa from the main office, her voice tight with something he recognized immediately. Urgency wrapped in forced calm. "Copy. What's up?" "Got a worried father on line 2. His daughter missed her last 3 check-ins. Solo hiker, 48 hours overdue in the Enchanted Valley area." Christopher's hand stilled on a coil of rope. 48 hours. The magic number where overdue became missing and missing started its slow transformation into recovery. "I'll take it." The transfer clicked through and Robert Mitchell's voice filled his ear, strained, desperate, clinging to hope the way drowning men cling to driftwood. "Please, you have to find her. Hannah's careful. She always calls when she says she will. Always." Christopher pulled up the digital map on his computer, stylus hovering. "Mr. Mitchell, I need you to walk me through her planned route. Every detail you remember." She started at Graves Creek Trailhead 3 days ago, planned to hike up to Pony Bridge, then follow the Quinault River north. She wanted to see the valley. Robert's breath hitched. "She texted me a photo from the bridge. That was Wednesday afternoon. She was supposed to call that night. Then yesterday morning. Then last night. She never misses. Never." "Did she mention any side trails? Any detours?" A pause. "She asked me about some ravine. Said other hikers at the campground told stories about it. I told her to stay on the main trail." His voice cracked. "God, I told her it was probably just local legends." Christopher's stylus scraped against the screen. He knew which ravine. Everyone who'd worked Olympic longer than a season knew about Devil's Throat, though that name appeared on no official map. Just Tributary Ravine 7 on the USGS surveys. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm heading out now. I'll find her." After the call ended, Christopher sat motionless, staring at the glowing screen. The ravine icon pulsed with his cursor's movement. 12 years. He'd avoided that sector for 12 years, always finding reasons to assign it to other rangers, always volunteering for the northern quadrants instead. He pressed his palms against his eyes until phosphenes bloomed. When he opened them, his hands were steady. The pack came together with practiced efficiency. Garmin InReach satellite communicator, first aid kit, emergency bivvy, water filtration, 4 days of food, technical rescue rope, headlamp with spare batteries. His fingers moved through the checklist automatically while his mind assembled something else. A different kind of preparation, one that had nothing to do with equipment. By 7:30 he was on the trail. The Olympic rainforest swallowed him within minutes, the moss-draped Sitka spruces creating a green tunnel that muffled sound and distorted distance. Everything dripped. Water beaded on sword ferns, trickled down vine maple branches, pattered on the broad leaves of Devil's Club. The air tasted of decay and growth happening simultaneously. That peculiar richness of a forest that had been eating itself and rebuilding for millennia. Christopher fell into the rhythm of the trail, boots finding purchase on exposed roots, body swaying around obstacles without conscious thought. This part he could do. This part was muscle memory and map reading and weather assessment. He checked his GPS every 15 minutes, marked his progress on the laminated map, documented everything in his weatherproof notebook. At 9:20, he reached Pony Bridge, Hannah's last confirmed location. The bridge was a simple wooden span across the Quinault, sturdy and well-maintained with a small clearing on the far side where backpackers often stopped. Christopher found what he was looking for almost immediately. Fresh boot prints in the soft earth, size 7 or 8. Lug pattern consistent with modern hiking boots. He photographed them, noted their direction. She'd continued north as planned. But there, 20 feet past the bridge, a second set of prints veered west toward the river. Christopher knelt, studying the deviation. No hesitation in the stride, no scuff mark suggesting she'd slipped. A deliberate choice to leave the main trail. He followed the prints to the river's edge. They stopped at a game trail, barely visible, the kind of path made by elk and black-tailed deer, not humans. It paralleled the river, heading upstream toward higher elevations. Toward tributary ravine 7. Christopher stood there for a long time, watching the Kino slide past, gray-green and cold. He could radio for backup, should radio for backup. But the words his supervisor would use echoed in his head. "Not that area again, Chris. We talked about this. You've got to let it go." He keyed his radio. "Marissa, I've got Hannah's trail. Following it northwest from Pony Bridge, coordinates 47.7392, 123.5701. Solo tracking for now. Trail's too narrow for a team." "Copy. Check in every 2 hours." "Will do." He didn't tell her where the trail was leading. The game trail climbed steadily, forcing Christopher to use his hands on the steeper sections. The forest changed as he gained elevation, the massive spruces giving way to western hemlock and Pacific silver fir, the understory thinning to huckleberry and Oregon grape. The temperature dropped. His breath began to fog. At 11:45, he found Hannah's first campsite. She'd used a flat spot beside the trail, probably spent Wednesday night here. The ground showed the rectangular depression of a sleeping pad, and she'd hung her food bag from a branch 15 feet up, proper bear protocol. A small fire ring held cold ashes. Christopher sifted through the ashes, completely cold, more than 24 hours, probably closer to 36. The boot prints continued upward. The trail grew fainter. Several times Christopher lost it entirely, had to cast in widening circles until he picked up a scuff mark on a rock or a broken twig at the right height. Hannah was moving with purpose, following something. But what? At 1:30 p.m., the forest opened onto a ridgeline. The view should have been spectacular. The Kinole Valley spread below, the river a silver thread, the mountains layering into blue distance. But fog was rolling in from the west, thick and fast, swallowing the landscape in gray nothing. Christopher checked his GPS. He was 3 miles from tributary ravine 7. He ate an energy bar mechanically, forcing himself to drink water, to rest his legs. Standard procedure. Maintain your strength. Don't rush. Hasty rescuers become victims. But his hands shook slightly as he packed the wrapper away. The fog thickened as he continued, reducing visibility to 30 feet, then 20. Sounds became muffled and directional cues vanished. Christopher relied on his compass, stopping every few minutes to confirm his bearing. The boot prints remained visible, pressed into soft moss, scraped across stone. At 3:15, he heard water. Not the distant rush of the river, but something closer. The gurgling, irregular rhythm of a creek. He emerged onto a rocky slope where a small stream tumbled downward, disappearing into the fog below. According to his map, this fed into tributary ravine 7. He was close now. The boot prints followed the stream. Christopher descended carefully, one hand on the stream bank, testing each foothold. The sound of water grew louder, developing depth and echo that suggested a confined space. The temperature dropped further. His breath came out in thick clouds. Then the fog shifted, and he saw it. The ravine opened like a wound in the earth, a narrow gash 40 feet wide and impossibly deep, its walls disappearing into mist. The stream poured over the edge in a thin waterfall, its sound swallowed by the void. Trees leaned inward from both sides, their branches interweaving overhead to create a tunnel of vegetation that blocked what little light remained. Devil's Throat. Christopher's chest tightened. His vision tunneled briefly, sounds receding except for his own breathing, too fast, too shallow. He forced himself to stop, to count. 5 things he could see: rock, moss, bark, water, fog. 4 things he could hear: waterfall, wind, his breath, a raven somewhere above. 3 things he could touch: rough stone under his palm, cold air on his face, the weight of his pack. The panic receded. Mostly. Hannah's boot prints led to the ravine's edge and stopped. Christopher approached slowly, carefully, fighting the urge to call out. He knelt at the rim, examining the ground. The prints paced back and forth along the edge. 10 feet of disturbed earth showing multiple passes. She'd stood here for some time, maybe debating her next move. Then he saw the rope. Someone had anchored a climbing rope to a Douglas fir 20 feet back from the edge. The rope was old, sun-faded orange, the kind recreational climbers used in the 90s. It disappeared over the rim. Christopher's radio crackled. "Christopher, 2-hour check-in." He keyed the transmit button. "Copy. I'm at Tributary Ravine 7, elevation 2,800 feet. Found evidence the subject descended into the ravine, investigating now." A longer pause than usual. "Christopher, do you need backup?" "Negative. Ravine's too technical for a team response right now. I'm going to assess and report back." "Be careful." He tested the anchor rope. It held firm, but the knotwork was sloppy. The webbing wrapped wrong around the tree. Not ranger work, not professional work, but someone had used it recently. The rope showed fresh scuff marks where it bent over the rim. Christopher pulled his own climbing rope from his pack, set a proper anchor with webbing and locking carabiners, backed it up with a second point. He clipped in his belay device, checked his harness 3 times, and began to descend. The world contracted to the stone wall before him and the rope in his hands. He walked backward down the ravine face, boots finding small ledges, his headlamp cutting through the fog in a narrow cone of LED light. Water dripped from the walls, making everything slick. The sound of the waterfall echoed strangely, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. 20 feet down, the wall became vertical. Christopher shifted to a full rappel, managing his descent in controlled slides. 30 feet. 40. The fog below showed no sign of thinning. At 60 feet, his boots touched the bottom. If this story is holding your attention, follow for more quality content. What would you do in Christopher's situation? Share your thoughts. The ravine floor was a jumble of moss-covered boulders and standing water. Christopher unclipped from his rope and swept his headlamp in a slow arc. The walls rose on both sides, narrowing to a strip of gray sky barely visible through the fog and overhanging branches. The creek ran down the center, disappearing into a crack between 2 large rocks. "Hannah?" His voice echoed, came back distorted. "Hannah Mitchell? Forest Service?" Nothing. He moved downstream, following the water's path. The ravine twisted, opening into a slightly wider area where someone had made camp. Christopher saw it all at once. A tent still standing, a pack leaning against a boulder, a sleeping bag half out of its stuff sack. "Hannah?" He approached the tent. The door was partially unzipped. He knelt, shone his light inside. Empty. But there was blood on the sleeping bag. Not much. A smear on the fabric already dried to brown. Christopher's training kicked in. He documented with photos, checked for more blood outside the tent. None. The amount was consistent with a minor cut, nothing suggesting serious injury. Hannah's pack sat exactly where she'd left it, contents visible through the open top. Food, water filter, rain gear. Her journal lay beside it, a pen marking her place. Christopher picked up the journal, flipped to the marked page. Hannah's handwriting was neat, deliberate. Wednesday, 8:30 p.m., made camp in the ravine. I know Dad would freak if he knew I came down here, but the hikers at Pony Bridge were so insistent. They said this is where you see them, the Lost 12. They said if you come at dusk, you can hear them calling to each other, trying to find their way out of the avalanche. They said it's beautiful and terrible. I have to know if it's true. Christopher's throat tightened. He flipped forward a page. Thursday, 6:15 a.m. I heard them last night. I swear I heard them. Voices in the fog speaking over each other, some crying, some laughing, some just making sounds that weren't quite words. I counted 12 distinct voices. When I tried to record on my phone, the battery died even though it was fully charged. I feel strange, lightheaded, but I need to stay. I need to understand. The next entry was written in a shakier hand. Thursday, 11 a.m. The voices don't stop. Even in daylight, I hear them. They're getting closer. Sometimes I see movement in the fog, but when I look directly, there's nothing. I should leave. I know I should leave, but I can't find my rope. I left it anchored at the top, but when I tried to climb out this morning, it wasn't there. I used the orange rope instead, someone else's rope just hanging there. But I only got halfway up before I got dizzy. Too dizzy. Had to come back down. I'll try again tomorrow. After I rest, the voices sound so sad. The final entry was barely legible, the letters wandering across the page. Thursday night or Friday, I don't know anymore. They have names. Margaret and Douglas and James and Ruth and all the others. 12 names, they tell me over and over. They died together in 1952, February 19th. The avalanche came down from Sentinel Peak and buried them all in this ravine. They were trying to reach the ranger station. They were so close. They're still trying. They show me where they are. Under the rocks. Under the water. Under everything. They want me to stay. They say it's lonely being lost forever. They say one more won't matter. They say... The entry stopped mid-sentence. Christopher closed the journal, his hands steadier than they should be. He'd read these words before. Different handwriting, different names, but the same progression, the same descent. He knew what came next. Hannah. His shout echoed through the ravine, multiplied, returned to him from a dozen directions. Hannah Mitchell, can you hear me? A sound drifted through the fog. Laughter. High and bright and utterly wrong for this place. Christopher spun, his headlamp beam cutting through nothing. The laughter came again from a different direction. Then another voice joined it, and another, until the ravine filled with a chorus of voices. Talking, singing, crying, laughing, all at once, all overlapping into a sound that made his teeth ache. He knew this sound. He'd heard it 12 years ago, when he'd come into this ravine looking for another lost hiker. When he'd found her standing among the boulders, her eyes unfocused, speaking to people who weren't there. When she'd turned to him and smiled and said, "They want us both to stay." He'd gotten her out. Barely. She'd fought him every step, screaming about abandoning her new friends, about betraying the lost 12. At the hospital, the doctor said severe hypothermia, dehydration, possibly a head injury, auditory hallucinations, nothing supernatural, nothing impossible. But Christopher had heard the voices too. The laughter cut off abruptly. In the silence that followed, a single voice spoke. Female, young, very close. Ranger? Christopher turned. Hannah stood 10 feet away, appearing from the fog as if she'd materialized from it. She wore hiking clothes soaked through with water, her blonde hair plastered to her skull. Her eyes reflected his headlamp beam like an animal's. Hannah. Thank God. Your parents are worried sick. Let's get you out of here. She tilted her head, the gesture oddly mechanical. Did you hear them? The 12? I heard something. You're hypothermic, Hannah. Confused. Let me help you. They told me about you. She took a step closer. Christopher Reeves, age 42, works Olympic National Park. Came into the ravine 12 years ago. Another step. They remember her. Sarah. She talked about you for years afterward. The ranger who didn't believe. The ranger who took her away. Christopher's blood pressure spiked, his vision sharpening with adrenaline. How do you know Sarah's name? Hannah smiled. It wasn't her smile. It was too wide, too knowing. We all know each other here. Everyone who comes down, we share. She gestured at the fog around them. Margaret told me. Margaret remembers everyone. There's no Margaret. You're experiencing hallucinations from Margaret Hollis, age 29. Died February 19th, 1952 at 3:47 p.m. when the avalanche hit. Hannah's voice had changed, taking on a rhythmic quality, like recitation. Douglas Kemp, James Patterson, Ruth Chen, Howard Mills, Catherine Webb, all 12. They tell me their names in my dreams now. They want me to write them down. They want someone to remember. Christopher moved toward her slowly, hands visible, non-threatening. Hannah, I'm going to get you warm and dry. Then we're going to climb out together, okay? She didn't move as he approached. didn't blink. When he reached for her arm, she was ice cold through her jacket. "You can't take me away," she said softly. "I promised them I'd stay. Just like Sarah promised. Just like all the others promised." "What others?" Hannah's smile widened impossibly further. "The ones who didn't leave." The voices exploded around them, a cacophony of sound that seemed to come from inside Christopher's skull as much as from the ravine. He grabbed Hannah's arm and she screamed, the sound cutting through the chaos. But it wasn't a scream of pain or fear, it was rage. She twisted in his grip with strength that didn't match her frame, fingers clawing at his face. Christopher caught her wrists, forced her arms down, using his weight to control her. "Hannah, stop! You're not thinking clearly." "They need me!" she thrashed against him. "They need someone to remember. Someone has to stay." Christopher wrestled her toward the tent, toward her pack and sleeping bag. He needed to get her warm, get electrolytes in her, stabilize her before attempting the climb. But Hannah fought every inch, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her eyes wild. Then she went completely limp. Christopher lowered her to the ground, checking her pulse, strong and steady. She'd passed out. Exhaustion, probably, combined with whatever physiological stress she'd been under. He worked quickly, stripping off her wet layers, getting her into dry clothes from her pack, sliding her into his emergency bivy sack. He heated water on his small stove, prepared an electrolyte drink for when she woke. The voices had stopped. The silence felt worse. Christopher set up his satellite communicator, fingers moving across the screen. He typed a message to Park Dispatch, found subject, alive, showing signs of severe hypothermia and altered mental status, preparing for technical evacuation at first light. We'll need med team at Trailhead. The device showed sending for 30 seconds, then message delivered. He checked his watch. 4:47 p.m. Darkness would come in less than 2 hours. They'd have to wait until morning to attempt the climb. Rappelling up with an uncooperative patient in failing light was suicide. Christopher set up his own shelter beside Hannah's tent, prepared for a long night. He forced himself to eat, to drink, to go through the mechanical rituals of camp life. Every few minutes he checked on Hannah. She remained unconscious, her breathing steady, her core temperature slowly rising. At 6:30, full darkness arrived. Christopher sat in his tent with the door open, headlamp off, letting his eyes adjust. The ravine at night was profoundly black, the kind of darkness that existed before humans invented fire. He could hear the creek, the occasional drip of water, wind moving through the trees far above. Nothing else. He must have dozed because he jerked awake to find his watch reading 11:43 p.m. and his breath coming out in visible clouds. The temperature had dropped dramatically. Christopher reached for his headlamp and heard singing. A woman's voice, clear and pure, singing something that might have been a hymn. Then a man's voice joined, and another woman's, and more, building into a chorus of 12 voices, singing in imperfect harmony. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the stone walls, seeming to emanate from the rocks themselves. Christopher grabbed his headlamp, flicked it on. The beam cut through empty darkness. The singing continued, unaffected by light. He crawled to Hannah's bivvy, unzipped it partially. She was awake, staring up at nothing, tears streaming down her face. "They're beautiful," she whispered. "Listen to them. So beautiful." "Hannah, there's nothing there. It's auditory hallucinations. Your brain is..." "Your brain too?" She turned her head to look at him, and her eyes were completely lucid. That was somehow worse than the earlier wildness. "You hear them too, Christopher. Just like you did with Sarah. Just like you've heard them in your nightmares for 12 years. He wanted to deny it. The denial died in his throat. "Tell me what happened with Sarah," Hannah said softly. "The real story. Not the official report." Christopher sat back on his heels. The singing continued, a lullaby now, gentle and sad. "I got her out," he said finally. "She fought me the whole way. Scratched my face bloody, screaming about betraying them, about abandoning the 12. I had to partially sedate her just to get her up the rope. At the hospital, she was diagnosed with severe hypothermia, dehydration, temporary psychosis. She recovered physically. They said she'd be fine. But she wasn't. No. Christopher's voice was barely audible. She was never the same. Quit her job. Moved back to Oregon. I heard from her brother once about 6 months later. She'd started having nightmares, hearing voices. She couldn't be in quiet places. She couldn't be alone. The doctors called it PTSD from her ordeal. What did you call it? Christopher didn't answer immediately. The singing swelled, reaching some crescendo he didn't understand, then faded to whispers. I didn't know what to call it. I tried to convince myself it was trauma. Environmental factors, mass hysteria, anything rational. But you heard them too. I heard something. Did they tell you their names, the 12? Despite himself, Christopher nodded. Every single one. Margaret and Douglas and James and Ruth and all the rest. I heard them in the ravine that day. I heard them in my dreams for months afterward. I still hear them sometimes when it's very quiet and I'm almost asleep. He looked at Hannah. That's why I hadn't been back to this ravine in 12 years. Why I should have called for backup today. He stopped, realizing he was telling her things he'd never told anyone. Not the counselor the Park Service made him see. Not his ex-wife during the divorce that followed. Not the bottle he'd lived in for 2 years before finally clawing his way out. Hannah sat up slowly, the bivy sack crinkling. What if they're real? Don't. What if the avalanche really did kill 12 people in 1952? What if they really are trapped here somehow, caught between... I said don't. Christopher's voice was sharp. That's how it starts. That's how you end up like Sarah or like me, unable to function because you're questioning everything you thought you knew about reality. We're hearing something, yes. Some acoustic phenomenon created by the ravine's shape or infrasound produced by... Do you believe that? I have to believe that. The singing stopped. In the silence that followed, a new sound emerged. Footsteps on stone, coming closer. Multiple sets of footsteps approaching from different directions. Christopher grabbed his headlamp, swept it across the ravine. Nothing. The footsteps continued, growing louder, until they seemed to circle the tents. He spun, the beam finding only stone and water and fog. Then the beam passed across something that shouldn't be there. A figure stood beside the creek. Female, wearing clothes from another era. Wool pants, a heavy jacket, hiking boots that were almost comically antiquated. She was translucent like fog given human shape, and she was looking directly at Christopher. He blinked. She remained. You see her too? Hannah's voice was very calm. I see something. More figures emerged from the fog. A man in a plaid shirt. Another woman in a long skirt. An elderly man with a walking stick. They appeared one by one until 12 shapes surrounded the campsite, standing motionless, watching. Christopher's rational mind cataloged everything. Shared hallucination caused by environmental factors, suggestion, stress, possible carbon monoxide from the camping stove, possible water contamination, possible... The figure closest to him, the first woman, opened her mouth and spoke. He doesn't want to believe. Her voice was the one that had been singing. Margaret. This was Margaret. Even though he knows. Even though he's always known. Christopher found his voice. You're not real. You're a manifestation of... Christopher. Hannah touched his arm. Look at the rocks. He followed her gaze. Behind the figures, barely visible in his headlamp beam, he saw bones. Human bones. Partially buried in sediment between boulders. A skull appeared in the gap between two rocks. A rib cage emerged from the creek bed. The avalanche buried us, Margaret said. We died down here, all 12. The rescue teams searched, but the snow was too deep, and then spring came and everything shifted. We were lost. Her translucent face showed infinite sadness. For 73 years we've been lost. No. Christopher stood, backing toward his tent. No. This is stress. This is trauma. This is real. Another voice. The man in plaid. Douglas. We're real. We were real. We're still here, caught in the moment of our dying, and we can't leave. The elderly man with the walking stick stepped forward. We don't mean harm. We just want to be remembered. We want someone to know we existed. We want our families to have closure. Families who are dead now, Christopher said harshly. If this even happened. If any of this is real. February 19th, 1952, Margaret said. Check the records. 12 hikers left the Enchanted Valley Ranger Station attempting to reach Graves Creek before a storm hit. They never arrived. Their bodies were never recovered. They were declared lost to avalanche. She gestured at the bones. We're still here. We've always been here. Christopher's world tilted. He'd worked this park for 18 years. He'd heard the legends, of course. Every park had ghost stories, but he'd never researched them, never wanted to give them legitimacy. Why? Hannah's question was directed at the figures. Why do you call people down here? Why do you make them want to stay? The 12 looked at each other, and something passed between them. Some communication Christopher couldn't hear or understand. Finally, Margaret spoke again. We're lonely. We've been alone so long with only each other, watching the seasons change through fog. When someone comes down, we can feel them, feel their warmth, their life. We don't mean to trap them. We want connection so badly that we hold too tight. Sarah, Christopher said. What did you do to Sarah? We held her too tight. We were desperate for someone to understand, to acknowledge us. We poured ourselves into her, trying to make her see, make her remember us. We didn't know it would break her. Margaret's form flickered. We learned to be gentler, with Hannah, with the others who've come. How many others? 3 since Sarah. We let them go. They left changed, but they left. We're learning. The figure that might have been James stepped forward. We just want someone to tell the world we're here, to give our families closure, even though those families are gone now, to mark this place so hikers know, to remember. Christopher looked at Hannah. She sat in the bivy sack, tears still on her face, but her expression was clear, rational, seeing the same impossible things he saw. If I report finding remains, Christopher said slowly, there will be an investigation, forensic teams. They'll excavate. They'll identify you through dental records, DNA if any survives. Your names will be in the papers again. Your story will be told, and we can rest. Margaret's voice held desperate hope. I don't know how any of this works. But you'll try? Christopher looked at the bones scattered through the ravine, at the 12 translucent figures watching him with expressions that ranged from hope to desperation to infinite weariness. At Hannah, alive and conscious and waiting for his answer. At Sarah somewhere in Oregon, still hearing voices in the quiet. Yes, he said. I'll try. The figures began to fade, becoming more translucent, blending back into the fog. Margaret lingered longest. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for seeing us. Then she was gone, and Christopher and Hannah were alone in the darkness. They didn't speak for a long time. Christopher sat in his tent entrance, Hannah in her bivy, both staring at the place where the 12 had stood. The bones remained visible, undeniable proof of something, though Christopher's mind still struggled to categorize exactly what. Finally, Hannah spoke. What do we tell them? My parents, the Park Service, everyone. The truth, Christopher said. The truth they'll believe. That you got disoriented in the ravine, experienced hypothermia-induced hallucinations, that I found you and brought you out safely. He paused. And that I found human remains consistent with the 1952 missing hikers incident. And the rest? The rest stays here, with us. Hannah nodded slowly. Will it break me? Like it broke Sarah? Christopher considered lying, offering false comfort. He owed her more than that. I don't know. I'm still dealing with what I experienced 12 years ago. But I can give you the name of the counselor who helped me. I can check in with you. I can be honest that some experiences change you, and maybe that's not always bad. Maybe sometimes being broken open is the only way to see what's really there. That's not very reassuring. No, but it's true. They stayed awake until dawn, talking quietly about small things. Hannah's college major, environmental science. Christopher's divorce, amicable eventually. The weather, clearing. The forest, beautiful and terrible. Building a connection, a lifeline, an understanding that they'd both seen something the world wouldn't accept, and that shared burden would link them forever. At first light, Christopher prepared for the evacuation. He helped Hannah into a harness, triple-checked every connection, and radioed for the medical team to be ready at the trailhead. The climb was slow and careful, with Christopher providing belay from below while Hannah ascended, then following on a prusik knot after she reached the top. The world above seemed impossibly bright after the ravine's darkness. They stood on the rim, breathing hard, looking at each other with the shared expression of people who'd survived something that shouldn't exist. "Ready?" Christopher asked. "No, but let's go anyway." The hike out took 6 hours. Hannah was weak, dehydrated, but stable. Christopher maintained professional composure, documented everything, called in regular position reports. At 2:30 p.m., they emerged at Graves Creek trailhead to find an ambulance waiting, along with Hannah's parents, who collapsed against their daughter with sobs that could be heard across the parking lot. Christopher gave his initial report to his supervisor, keeping it clinical and factual. Subject found alive in tributary ravine 7, mild hypothermia, dehydration, minor psychological stress from isolation, and yes, he'd found what appeared to be human remains from the 1952 avalanche incident. He'd marked the coordinates. A recovery team should be sent. Over the following weeks, forensic anthropologists excavated the ravine. They found bones belonging to 12 individuals. Dental records and period-appropriate artifacts confirmed them as the missing 1952 hiking party. Their families, or what remained of their families, were notified. Small memorial services were held. The local paper ran a story. Lost hikers found after 73 years. It mentioned Christopher's discovery, Hannah's rescue, the closure brought to decades-old tragedy. It said nothing about voices or singing or translucent figures in the fog. Christopher visited Sarah in Oregon. She met him at a coffee shop, looking older than her years but stable, employed, living with a partner, functional. "You went back," she said. It wasn't a question. "I had to." "Did you hear them?" "Yes." "Did you see them?" "Yes." Sarah's hands shook slightly around her coffee cup. "What does it mean? That we both experienced the same impossibility?" "I don't know. I've stopped trying to know." "Does it get easier? The not knowing?" Christopher thought about his last 12 years. The nightmares, the questions, the slow journey from trauma to acceptance to something like peace. "It gets different. That's all I can promise." Hannah recovered physically within days. Psychologically took longer. She transferred to a different college, closer to home. She changed her major to anthropology, specializing in the intersection of folklore and historical fact. She wrote her senior thesis on the Lost 12, winning academic awards for her research. She never went backpacking alone again. Christopher returned to work. He continued leading search and rescue operations, including, for the first time in 12 years, operations near tributary Ravine 7. The area felt different now, quieter. The forest still dripped, and the fog still rolled in, but something essential had changed. He never heard the 12 voices again. Some nights, lying in his cabin with the windows open and the forest sounds drifting in, Christopher wondered if they'd found rest, if being found, being remembered had released them from whatever had kept them trapped. He wanted to believe that. He chose to believe that. Other nights, he wondered if he'd experienced a shared delusion, if the bones were coincidence, if the human mind was simply that good at creating patterns and meaning from chaos. He couldn't prove what he'd seen, couldn't offer evidence beyond his own memory and Hannah's matching experience. Both explanations terrified him equally. On the anniversary of finding Hannah, Christopher hiked back to Devil's Throat. He rappelled into the ravine alone, something he'd sworn he'd never do again. The excavation site had been filled in, the bones removed to proper rest. Only the creek remained, flowing as it always had, indifferent to human tragedy. Christopher stood in the place where he'd seen the 12, where Margaret had thanked him, where reality had bent far enough to show him something he still couldn't name. "I hope you're at peace," he said to the fog. "Wherever you are, whatever you are, I hope someone remembering was enough." The ravine offered no answer, just water and stone and the particular silence of places where death has occurred. Christopher climbed out as the sun set, reaching the rim as darkness fell. He looked back once, his headlamp cutting a cone of light down into the depths. Nothing looked back. He turned toward the trail, toward the living world, toward questions that might never be answered. Behind him, the ravine breathed and whispered and kept its secrets. Ahead, the path stretched into darkness, each step a choice to keep moving forward despite, or perhaps because of, all the things he'd never fully understand. The forest swallowed him. The fog rolled in. The 12 rested, or didn't, in whatever place exists between remembering and forgetting, between the living and the lost, and Christopher walked on. Thank you for reading to the end. If you enjoyed this narrative, consider following for more engaging stories. What's your interpretation of what Christopher and Hannah truly experienced? Supernatural reality or shared psychological phenomenon? I'd love to read your theories in the comments. The phone rang at 4:47 a.m., and Christopher Hayes knew before answering that someone was missing. 6 years as a ranger in Olympic National Park had taught him the specific quality of pre-dawn calls, the desperate timbre that meant a person hadn't returned, that hope was measured in hours, that families were already imagining the worst. He picked up on the second ring, Elena stirring beside him in their bed, her hand finding his shoulder in the dark. "Hayes," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "Ranger Hayes, this is Detective Raymond Mitchell, Seattle PD, retired." The man's voice carried the practiced steadiness of someone accustomed to delivering bad news, but underneath it ran a current of barely controlled fear. "My daughter Hannah hasn't checked in for 36 hours. She was researching in the Hoh rainforest near the Sol Duc Divide. I need you to find her." Chris was already sitting up, reaching for the notebook on his nightstand. "When did you last hear from her?" "Tuesday morning, 9:15, text message. She said she'd found the location she was looking for and would be out of range for a day, maybe 2. But it's been longer than that, and Hannah's methodical. She wouldn't..." The man's voice fractured slightly. "She wouldn't just go silent." "What was she researching?" Chris wrote the date and time in the margin, his handwriting automatic after thousands of incident reports. "Historical logging operations. She's getting her master's in anthropology at UW. Her thesis is about the 1923 Matheson Camp disaster." Mitchell paused, and in that silence, Chris felt something cold and familiar settle in his chest. "She specifically mentioned she was looking for the original camp location, the one that's not on any modern maps." Chris's pen stopped moving. The Matheson Camp. He'd heard the name before, though park policy was to discourage curiosity about it. 23 loggers dead in a single night, their bodies found scattered through 5 square miles of forest. The official cause listed as catastrophic structural failure and subsequent exposure. The unofficial stories, the ones passed between rangers during long winter shifts, were far stranger. "Mr. Mitchell," Chris said carefully, "did Hannah mention anything unusual in her messages? Anything that seemed off?" "She said the place felt wrong. That was the word she used. Wrong. But she's a scientist, Hayes. She doesn't spook easy." Mitchell's breath caught. "But I do. I'm a father and something's not right. I called the main office yesterday and they said you were the one to talk to. They said you knew that area better than anyone." They said more than that, Chris thought. They said he was the ranger who understood that some disappearances in the Olympics couldn't be explained by hypothermia, or falling, or getting turned around in the fog. They said it quietly, carefully, the way people reference things they don't want to name directly. "I'll head out within the hour," Chris said. "Text me her last known coordinates and any photos she sent." "Hayes?" Mitchell's voice dropped lower. "They also said you'd been through something 6 years ago, that you'd understand why I'm calling you specifically, why I'm not waiting for the standard search protocols." Chris looked at Elena, who was fully awake now, watching him with the expression she'd worn too often lately, concern mixed with resignation. "I'll find her," he said, and ended the call before Mitchell could ask the questions Chris didn't want to answer. The coordinates came through as he was pulling on his gear. 47.8422 to Ground, 123, 8791 degree W deep in the hose interior, well off any maintained trail. The attached photo showed Hannah's camp, a green tent pitched beneath massive Sitka spruces, her backpack propped against a moss-covered nurse log. Nothing appeared disturbed, but something in the image made Chris study it longer than necessary. The trees in the background seemed to lean inward, their branches forming patterns that his mind insisted had meaning, though he couldn't articulate what. The second photo was a close-up of a carved wooden marker, weathered and half buried in decades of decomposed needles. The carving was crude but deliberate, MC 1923. "You're going alone?" Elena asked from the doorway, holding his thermos of coffee. "It's faster." Chris checked his pack. GPS unit, spare batteries, satellite phone, first aid kit, emergency beacon, rope, water purification tablets. The list was automatic, but his hands moved with extra care. Mitchell said 36 hours, if she's injured. "Chris." Elena's voice made him stop. "Is this about 2008? He wanted to tell her no, that every search wasn't connected to the night he'd lost Aaron Cooper on the Hurricane Ridge Trail, that he'd moved past finding his partner's body 3 miles from where they'd separated, moved past the fact that Aaron's watch had stopped at 2:17 a.m., though Chris had last seen him at 10:30 p.m., and the medical examiner couldn't explain the 4-hour discrepancy. He wanted to tell her he didn't still wake up some nights hearing Aaron's voice calling from impossible directions, that he'd accepted the official explanation of disorientation and fatal hypothermia. "It's about finding someone's daughter," he said instead, which was true enough. Elena handed him the thermos, then pulled him into a brief, tight embrace. "Come back," she whispered against his shoulder. "Don't make me explain to Maya why Daddy didn't come home again." The drive to the Ho Visitor Center took 90 minutes through pre-dawn darkness, fog thickening as the road wound deeper into the rainforest. Chris radioed dispatch at 6:15, logging his plans with Sarah Kim, the weekend coordinator. "You're going solo?" Sarah's voice crackled with static. "Protocol says minimum 2 for backcountry in those conditions. Subject's been missing 36+ hours. Time matters more than protocol." A pause then. "Chris, those coordinates you sent, that's near the old Matheson area, isn't it?" "Vicinity. You know the stories about that place." "I know a lot of stories, Sarah. Most of them are bullshit designed to scare tourists away from dangerous terrain." He tried to sound dismissive, but even he could hear the hollowness in his voice. "Mark Rodriguez saw lights out there last month. Said they moved wrong, like they were underwater. And Jenny Pack heard voices near Sol Duke that didn't match any of her search team. Mark saw bioluminescent fungi and Jenny heard acoustic echoes. The Ho has its own sound profile. Moisture, density, the way noise travels through old-growth canopy." Chris rattled off the explanations he'd given himself 100 times. "I'll check in every 2 hours. Your GPS tracking is active?" "Affirmative." "And Chris?" Sarah's tone shifted to something more personal. "I know what day it is. November 14th. 6 years exactly since he'd found Aaron." Chris closed his eyes briefly. "I'll be careful." He started hiking at 6:42, his headlamp cutting a narrow corridor through darkness that felt heavier than it should. The temperature was 48 degrees, typical for November in the Olympics, but the humidity made everything feel colder, wetter, more oppressive. Within minutes, condensation coated his jacket, his breath forming clouds that hung unnaturally long in the still air. The first 2 miles followed a legitimate trail. Though trail was generous, mostly it was a path of least resistance through sword ferns and salal, marked by occasional cairns and faded blazes on trees that had been saplings when the Matheson camp was still operational. Chris knew this forest intimately, could navigate by the specific patterns of moss growth and the angles of nurse logs. But something felt different today. The trees seemed to absorb his headlamp's beam rather than reflect it, and the usual sounds, the distant rush of the Ho River, the morning calls of varied thrushes and Pacific wrens, were absent. At mile 3, he left the trail entirely, following Hannah's coordinates northeast toward higher ground. Here the forest changed character. The Sitka spruces gave way to western hemlocks and Douglas firs, some of them 30 feet in circumference, their bark deeply furrowed with age. Fallen giants created barriers 20 feet high, forcing him to detour through gullies where water seeped perpetually from moss-covered soil. The fog grew thicker, reducing visibility to less than 40 feet. His GPS showed Hannah's camp as 1.2 miles ahead, but the terrain made straight-line travel impossible. Chris picked his way through Devil's Club thickets, the plant's spines catching on his pants despite his careful movement. At 8:15, he paused to check his satellite phone, 2 bars sufficient for emergencies, and sent Elena a brief text. Made good progress, all clear. The lie felt necessary, because nothing was clear. The fog moved strangely here, forming eddies and currents despite the absence of wind. Twice he thought he heard footsteps paralleling his path, but when he stopped to listen, there was only silence so complete it felt like pressure against his eardrums. At 8:47, he found the first marker. It was identical to the one in Hannah's photo. Weathered wood driven into the ground at an angle, the carved letters MC barely visible beneath years of lichen. Chris crouched beside it, pulling out his phone to compare. The carving matched exactly, but this marker was 80 yards northwest of Hannah's coordinates. He took a compass bearing, memorizing the angle, then continued toward the camp. He found 2 more markers in the next quarter mile, each one slightly different in size but bearing the same initials and date. They formed a rough perimeter, Chris realized, marking boundaries around something. The trees inside that perimeter were different, older, more twisted, their branches interlocking overhead to block what little light penetrated the fog. The ground was carpeted with moss so thick it absorbed sound, making each footstep feel muffled and distant. Hannah's tent appeared suddenly, materializing from the fog like something conjured rather than discovered. It was exactly as her photo showed. Green nylon, properly staked, rainfly secured. No visible damage, no signs of animal interference. Chris approached slowly, every ranger instinct alert. "Hannah," he called. His voice sounded wrong, flat and compressed. "Hannah Mitchell, this is Olympic National Park Search and Rescue. If you can hear me, respond." Nothing. Just that oppressive silence, and beneath it, or perhaps imagined, a sound like distant breathing. Chris circled the tent once, noting details. Her boots were lined up neatly outside the entrance, which made no sense if she'd left in a hurry. Her backpack was exactly where the photo showed it, and when he checked inside, he found her food properly stored in a bear canister, her water bottles full, her camp stove, and fuel untouched. Everything suggested someone who'd planned to return shortly, who'd stepped away for a quick task and never came back. The tent's zipper was closed but not locked. Chris opened it carefully, his heart rate elevating despite years of training. Inside, her sleeping bag was rolled neatly, her clothes organized in stuff sacks. A journal lay open on top of her sleeping pad. Chris pulled on gloves before touching it, though he knew he'd already contaminated the scene by his presence. The journal's pages were filled with Hannah's handwriting, neat, academic, interspersed with sketches and coordinates. He flipped to the last entry, dated Tuesday, November 11th, 9:02 a.m. Found the 4th marker. The pattern is definitely intentional. They form a containment boundary, not a property line. Surveyed the interior and discovered foundation remnants approximately 200 yards northeast of my camp. The stones are arranged in a double circle, which doesn't match any logging camp layouts I've researched. More importantly, I found carved warnings on several trees. Stay out, and they walk at night, and something in a language I don't recognize. The carvings are old, but not as old as 1923, maybe 1930s or 40s, added after the disaster. The locals were right about the feeling here. It's like the air is thicker, like there's pressure behind my eyes, probably just the altitude and moisture, but I understand now why the logging company abandoned the site rather than rebuilding. Whatever happened here in 1923 left a stain. Going to photograph the foundation before I lose light. If I'm not back in camp by dark, I'm staying out there. The moon's nearly full and I have my headlamp. I need to see this place at night. Dad would say that's stupid, but he taught me to trust my instincts, and my instincts say this is the key to everything. The entry ended there. Chris read it twice, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest, the one that had started 6 years ago and never fully released. Hannah had gone looking for the foundation at night, just like Aaron had insisted on checking one more section of trail at night. Chris photographed every page of the journal, then carefully placed it back where he'd found it. He radioed Sarah at 9:23. Found the camp. Subject not present. No signs of struggle or emergency. Investigating area. Copy that. How far are you going? Foundation site, approximately 200 yards northeast. I'll mark my route. Chris, be careful. The forecast is calling for heavy fog through tomorrow morning. Visibility under 20 feet. Already there, Chris said, looking at the gray wall surrounding him. Can barely see my own boots. He marked Hannah's camp with flagging tape, then took a bearing northeast. The foundation wouldn't be hard to find if Hannah's journal was accurate, but the terrain was treacherous. Hidden roots, sudden drop-offs concealed by ferns, rotting logs that could collapse under weight. Chris moved methodically, tying flagging tape to branches every 50 feet, creating a visible trail back. If this story is gripping you, follow for more quality horror narratives. What would you do in Christopher's position? Share your thoughts. The foundation emerged from the fog at exactly 220 yards, close enough to Hannah's estimate to confirm her measurements were precise. But Chris stopped walking 30 feet away, his body reacting before his mind fully processed what he was seeing. The stones were arranged in 2 concentric circles, each about 40 feet in diameter. But they weren't foundation stones. They were too deliberately placed, too ritualistic. Between the circles, someone had carved symbols into the soil, or perhaps into bedrock buried just beneath the moss. The symbols were still visible despite nearly a century of growth, suggesting they'd been cut deep and maintained somehow. But that wasn't what stopped him. In the center of the inner circle stood 7 wooden posts, each about 8 feet tall, each topped with what Chris initially thought were carved decorations. He moved closer, his hand instinctively moving to the bear spray on his belt, though he knew it wouldn't help against what he was actually afraid of. The decorations were metal objects, axes, saw blades, pike poles, tools that would have been common in a 1920s logging camp. They'd been driven into the posts deliberately, mounted like trophies or warnings. Rust streaked down the wood, decades of rain creating patterns that looked disturbingly organic. Chris counted the posts 3 times, getting the same answer each time. 7. But there had been 23 deaths at Matheson Camp. Where were the other 16? He circled the outer ring, photographing everything, noting details. The way the symbols seemed to flow in a clockwise pattern. The fact that the posts were all cedar despite the surrounding forest being predominantly hemlock and spruce. The peculiar absence of animal activity. No droppings, no tracks. No evidence that deer or elk ever crossed this space. It was when he reached the north side of the formation that he found Hannah's camera. It was a professional DSLR still attached to its strap, lying in the moss as if carefully placed rather than dropped. The lens cap was off, and when Chris picked it up, the power light flickered briefly before dying. Battery drained. He checked the memory card, which showed 247 photos. The most recent was time-stamped Tuesday, 9:47 p.m., 45 minutes after Hannah's last journal entry. Chris pulled out his own camera and removed the memory card, swapping it with Hannah's. He couldn't review the images here. His camera body wasn't compatible with her card, but he needed to preserve whatever she'd documented. He placed his card in her camera and left it where he'd found it. a marker for the investigative team that would inevitably follow. The fog was growing denser, morning transitioning to midday without any increase in light. Chris checked his GPS, 47.8439 de Claudine, 123.8805 degree W. The coordinates placed him just under a quarter mile from where Aaron had died 6 years ago, though that had been higher up the ridge near the tree line. Different location, he told himself. Different circumstances, different person missing, but the same feeling. That sensation of being watched by something that existed in peripheral vision, that vanished when he turned to look directly. That awareness of presence without form, of intelligence without benevolence. Chris keyed his radio. "Sarah, I'm at the Foundation site. Found the subject's camera, but no sign of the subject herself. I'm going to do a spiral search pattern, radius approximately 500 feet. Static then. Copy. Chris, your GPS is showing some anomalies. You're appearing and disappearing from tracking." He looked at his unit. The signal bars were fluctuating wildly, and his position was jumping around an area roughly 300 feet in diameter. "Equipment malfunction," he said, though he didn't believe it. "Probably the canopy and fog interfering with reception." "Maybe. But Mark's notes from last month mentioned the same thing. GPS dropout in that specific area." Chris didn't respond immediately. He was staring at one of the posts where something had changed. He was certain, absolutely certain, that the axe mounted on top had been facing west when he'd first photographed it. Now it pointed north, toward the ridge, toward where Aaron had died. "Chris, you still there?" "Yeah." He forced himself to look away from the post, to focus on the immediate problem. "Sarah, I need you to pull any incident reports from this area. Not just the Matheson disaster, everything. Disappearances, strange sightings, equipment failures. Go back as far as records exist. That'll take time. What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking Hannah Mitchell found something that scared her enough to drop a $2,000 camera and run. I need to know what." "Chris, if you're seeing signs that she fled, shouldn't you be looking for a pursuit trail? Animal attack, maybe?" "There's no trail, no tracks, no disturbance in the moss." Chris turned slowly, scanning 360 degrees. "It's like she just vanished." The word hung between them, weighted with implications neither wanted to address. "I'm calling in additional personnel," Sarah said finally. "We should have a full team out there by 1500 hours. "No." The response was automatic, visceral. "Not yet. Not until I understand what we're dealing with." "Chris, that's not... Give me until 1400. 2 more hours. If I haven't found her or determined what happened, then bring in the cavalry. But Sarah, I need you to trust me on this. Something about this situation requires careful handling." A long pause. "Because of what happened to Aaron." "Because I've been here before," Chris said quietly. "Not literally here, but I've stood in a place where someone disappeared without explanation, where the evidence didn't make sense, where every instinct screamed that the rules were different. And I let people dismiss those instincts as grief and trauma. I let them write official reports that felt true on paper but false in practice. I'm not doing that again." "Okay," Sarah said, though he could hear the concern in her voice. 1400. "But Chris, if you don't check in, I'm sending everyone. Park Service, County Sheriff, State Patrol. Everyone." "Understood." He pocketed the radio and began his spiral search, moving outward from the foundation in concentric circles. The technique was standard for lost person searches, based on the statistical likelihood that missing people were usually found within a quarter mile of their last known position. But statistics assumed logical behavior, and Chris was increasingly certain that logic had little to do with Hannah's disappearance. At 50 feet from the foundation, he found the first piece of evidence: a torn fragment of blue fabric caught on a devil's club spine. It matched the color of the jacket Hannah wore in her father's photos. Chris bagged it carefully, noting the GPS coordinates, or trying to since his unit was still malfunctioning. At 75 feet, he found a hiking boot. Just one. It was definitely Hannah's. Women's size 7, recent mud on the sole. the tread pattern matching prints he'd seen near her camp. But there was no sign of how it had come off. No scuff marks suggesting a struggle, no damaged laces, nothing to explain why someone running through this terrain would lose a single boot. At 100 feet, the forest changed again. The transition was subtle but unmistakable. The trees became more distorted, their trunks spiraling in ways that seemed to defy biology. The moss hung in longer curtains, and beneath its green surface, Chris could see darker shapes, patterns that almost resembled faces or hands, or things with no names. The fog here moved with deliberate purpose, forming columns and walls and corridors that shifted moment by moment. And there were sounds. They started quietly, barely distinguishable from the ambient noise of wind through branches and water dripping from needles. But gradually, Chris realized they were voices. Multiple voices, overlapping and discordant, speaking words that almost made sense but dissolved into confusion whenever he tried to focus on them. "Help me, I can't find... Been walking for days, the trail just... Something wrong with the light, it doesn't... Saw them last night standing between the trees, they weren't..." Chris froze, his hand moving to the bear spray again, though some part of him understood that pepper spray wouldn't help here. The voices were coming from multiple directions simultaneously, some near, some distant, all carrying that same quality of incompleteness, of meaning forever just out of reach. One voice rose above the others, clearer and more immediate. "Chris? Chris, is that you?" His heart stopped. He knew that voice. It had been 6 years, but he knew it absolutely. "Aaron?" The name escaped before he could stop it. "Chris, thank God. I've been lost for... I don't know how long. Days? The trail just ended and I couldn't find my way back and..." The voice broke, reformed. "Where are you? I can hear you, but I can't see you. Everything's fog." Chris's training fought against his grief and hope. This wasn't possible. Aaron was dead. He'd identified the body himself, had attended the funeral, had carried a piece of guilt for 6 years that would have been unnecessary if Aaron was somehow alive and lost. But God, he wanted it to be true. Wanted to believe that his friend had been out here, confused and scared, but alive, waiting for rescue. "Aaron, stay where you are," Chris called, hating the tremor in his voice. "Keep talking so I can locate you." "I'm trying, The voice shifted, took on a different quality. "Wait, no, this isn't right. Chris, don't listen. Don't come looking. It's not me, it's..." The voice multiplied, fractured into dozens of overlapping Aarons, all speaking at once. "Help me. It's a trick. I'm so cold. Run. Been dead for years. Save yourself." Chris backed away, his breath coming in sharp gasps, his vision tunneling. Not panic. He couldn't afford panic, but recognition. This was what Aaron had heard, what had drawn him away from the trail that night. Not a person calling for help, but something else. Something that used voices the way an anglerfish used light. The voices faded, leaving only one that was distinctly different from the others. Younger, female, terrified. "Dad? Dad, if you can hear me, I'm sorry. I should have listened. I should have stayed in camp. But I had to see. Had to know what really happened here. And now I understand. They're not ghosts. Not exactly. They're echoes. Pieces of the people who died trapped in the moment of their death, repeating it over and over. 23 men died at Matheson Camp, but they didn't die from structural failure. They died because they dug too deep, found something that should have stayed buried. The camp wasn't abandoned, it was sealed. Those posts, those symbols, they were trying to contain it. But containment fails, it always fails. Hannah's voice. Had to be. But where was it coming from? Chris spun, trying to pinpoint a direction, but the acoustics were impossible. Sound seemed to emanate from the fog itself. "Hannah, can you hear me? I'm Christopher Hayes, Olympic National Park. Your father sent me. Tell me where you are." "I don't know where I am. I've been walking for hours, but everything looks the same. The trees move when I'm not looking at them. The ground shifts. And they're here with me. The loggers. All 23 of them. They're trying to warn me about something, but they can't agree on what. Some say run, Some say hide, some say static. Then silence so profound that Chris's ears rang with it. He pulled out his satellite phone, hands shaking as he dialed Mitchell's number. It rang 4 times before connecting, the line crackling with interference. Hayes, did you find her? I found evidence she's alive, or was alive recently. I'm hearing what might be a recording of her voice, or... Chris struggled with the explanation. Mr. Mitchell, did Hannah have any audio recording equipment? Something that might have picked up her voice and played it back? What? No, just her camera. Hayes, what's going on? Chris looked at the forest surrounding him, at the fog that moved with purpose, at the trees that seemed closer than they'd been moments before. I need you to tell me everything Hannah learned about Matheson Camp. Not the official story, the real one. What actually happened there in 1923? Mitchell was quiet for several seconds. Hannah found a report that was never published, written by a Forest Service investigator who was on scene 2 days after the bodies were discovered. He described, "Listen, Hayes, this is going to sound crazy. Try me." He said the men weren't killed by falling timber or exposure. He said they were driven mad, that the entire camp had descended into some kind of collective hysteria in the days before the disaster. Men reported hearing voices, seeing figures in the forest, experiencing time distortions, hours passing in minutes, minutes stretching for hours. The company doctor tried to evacuate them, but they refused to leave. Said something in the forest wouldn't let them. Wouldn't let them. That's what the report said. On the night of the 23rd, all 23 men walked into the forest. They were found scattered across 5 square miles, each one alone, each one appearing to have died of exposure. But the investigator noted their positions formed a pattern. When he plotted them on a map, they outlined a containment boundary, Chris finished. Like the markers. How did you know that? Because I'm standing inside it. And Mr. Mitchell, I think your daughter figured out that the containment was failing, that whatever those men tried to seal away in 1923 is still here, still active. Jesus Christ, Hayes, get out of there. Get out and call for a full search team. Don't try to do this alone. But Chris wasn't alone. That was the problem. He was surrounded by presences he couldn't see, voices he couldn't locate, and a past that was bleeding into the present like water through cracked stone. I have to find her, Chris said. I couldn't save Aaron, but I can... Aaron? Mitchell's voice sharpened. Who's Aaron? Chris closed his eyes. My partner, 6 years ago, November 14th. He disappeared less than a mile from here. November 14th, today. Yes. Hayes, do you think that's a coincidence? Chris wanted to say yes. Wanted to believe in random chance and unhappy synchronicity, but he'd been lying to himself for 6 years and he was tired of it. No, he said. I don't think anything about this is coincidence. He ended the call before Mitchell could argue further, before he could voice the fear that Chris already carried, that some disappearances couldn't be prevented, that some places demanded sacrifice, that the forest took what it wanted and no amount of training or equipment or determination could stop it. But he hadn't come this far to give up. He'd promised Elena he'd come back, promised Mitchell he'd find Hannah, and beneath those promises was an older one, unspoken but binding, that he'd understand what happened to Aaron, that he'd face whatever truth lurked in these woods, even if that truth destroyed him. Chris continued his spiral, moving deeper into the zone where reality felt negotiable. At 200 feet, he found Hannah's other boot. At 250, her jacket, torn but not bloodied. At 300, her water bottle, still half full, dropped as if she'd simply forgotten she was carrying it. The items formed a trail, he realized. Not a trail of flight, but of gradual disintegration, as if Hannah had been shedding pieces of herself as she walked, or as if something had been taking them, claiming her bit by bit. At 350, the forest opened into a clearing Chris had never seen on any map. It was roughly circular, perhaps 60 feet in diameter, and utterly devoid of growth. No moss, no ferns, no seedlings. Just bare earth the color of old charcoal. In the center stood a structure that Chris's mind initially refused to process. cataloging it instead as wrong and impossible and shouldn't be. It was made of wood, the remains of the original camp, he thought, but the pieces had been rearranged. Timbers stood vertical where they should have lain horizontal. Walls curved where they should have been straight. Support beams intersected at angles that defied physics. The overall impression was less of a building and more of a cage, or a trap, or a door that opened in directions the human eye couldn't follow. And standing in front of it, her back to Chris, was Hannah Mitchell. She was barefoot and wearing only her base layers, her arms wrapped around herself against cold that Chris suddenly felt too. A bone-deep chill that had nothing to do with November temperatures. Her hair hung in wet tangles down her back, and even from 40 feet away, Chris could see her shaking. Hannah. He kept his voice calm, professional, the tone he'd use approaching any traumatized subject. Hannah Mitchell. I'm Ranger Christopher Hayes. Your father sent me. I'm here to help you. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge his presence in any way, but she spoke, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. They're inside. All of them. I can hear them talking, arguing about what to do. Some of them want to warn me. Some want me to join them, some just want me to understand. She tilted her head, as if listening to something Chris couldn't hear. They say you've been here before, that you left someone behind, that you'll leave me behind too, because that's what the forest demands. One stays, one goes. Those are the rules. Chris moved closer, every nerve alert for danger he couldn't name. That's not how this works, Hannah. No one's staying behind. I'm going to get you out of here, get you medical attention and... Medical attention. She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. For what? Exposure? Hypothermia? Is there a diagnosis for talking to dead people? For watching them die over and over? For understanding that time here works differently? That past and present and future are all happening simultaneously? Hannah, you're experiencing severe stress and possible hypothermia. Your judgment is compromised. I need you to trust me and... She turned. Chris stopped walking. Hannah's face was unmarked. No visible injuries, but her eyes held something that made his professional assessment, shock, exposure, dehydration, seem laughably inadequate. She looked at him with the expression of someone who'd witnessed the fundamental machinery of the universe and found it alien and hostile and indifferent to human suffering. You felt it, didn't you? She said. When your partner died, you felt the forest take him. Not physically, something deeper. You felt the moment he stopped being Aaron and became something else. Part of this place, part of the echo. Chris's throat closed. He'd never told anyone about that moment, about the sensation of wrongness that had struck him at 2:17 a.m. while he was miles away at base camp, about the way he'd known, absolutely known, that something irreversible had happened. The doctors had called it trauma response, his mind creating a narrative to explain irrational guilt. But it hadn't felt like imagination. It had felt like knowledge. I don't know what you're talking about, he managed. Yes, you do. You've always known. You just couldn't admit it because admission meant accepting that the world doesn't work the way you were taught, that there are places where the rules bend, where the dead don't rest, where, she gestured at the impossible structure behind her, where mistakes from the past never really end. What happened at Matheson Camp, Hannah? They dug a well for fresh water, but they hit something else instead, something old. The reports call it a cave system, but that's not what it was. It was a hollow place, a gap in the world, and things had been living in that gap for a very long time. The loggers released them. Released what? Hannah's expression shifted to something like pity. You already know, Ranger Hayes. You've heard them. Aaron's voice. My voice. All the voices of people who got too close, who stayed too long, who the forest decided to keep. We're all still here, all of us, caught in the moment between living and dying, replaying it forever. You're not dead, Chris said, though certainty was crumbling. You're standing right in front of me. You're alive, am I? She looked down at her hands, flexing her fingers slowly. I feel alive. I remember being alive, but I also remember dying, or starting to die. I remember. The structure behind her shifted, not physically moving, but changing in some fundamental way, as if the angles were rotating through dimensions Chris couldn't perceive. And from inside it came a sound, not voices this time, but something deeper, more primal. The sound of earth moving, of roots breaking, of something enormous and ancient stirring from long dormancy. "They're waking up," Hannah whispered. "The things in the hollow, the things the loggers trapped with their posts and symbols and prayers. The containment's been failing for decades, but my digging, my research, my questions, I weakened it further. And now it's almost gone." "Then we leave," Chris said, reaching for her. "Right now. We walk away and we—" "It doesn't work like that." Her voice rose to a shout, and for the first time Chris saw real fear in her expression. "Don't you understand? We're inside the boundary. Once you cross into the center, you can't just leave. The forest won't let you. One of us stays. That's always been the rule. The loggers learned it, Aaron learned it, and now we're learning it." "No." Chris backed away, his hand finding his radio. "That's not—" "I'm calling for extraction, full team. Helicopter if necessary. We're getting you out." But when he keyed the radio, all he got was static, and when he checked his satellite phone, the screen showed no signal despite having had 2 bars minutes earlier. And when he looked at his GPS, the coordinates were scrolling rapidly, showing him in dozens of locations simultaneously, as if he existed in multiple places at once. The clearing darkened, though Chris could see no clouds overhead, no reason for the light to fail. Shadows stretched toward the structure, reaching like fingers, and within them, Chris could see shapes. Human-shaped but wrong in ways that hurt to observe directly. 23 of them, standing between the trees, watching with empty eyes. "They're showing you what happened," Hannah said quietly. "They do this for everyone who comes here. They show the truth." The shadows moved, and Chris found himself watching a scene from 91 years ago. 23 men standing in this exact clearing, torches in hand, facing the structure that shouldn't exist. They were singing something, a hymn maybe, or a prayer, their voices desperate and determined. One by one they approached the structure. One by one they stepped inside. One by one Chris turned away, but the visions followed him. He saw Aaron on Hurricane Ridge, heard his partner calling for help, watched him follow those phantom voices deeper into territory that wasn't entirely physical anymore. He saw himself finding the body hours later, saw the expression on Aaron's face. Not fear, not pain, but bewilderment, as if he'd died while trying to understand an impossible equation. And he saw himself here now, facing the same choice those loggers had faced, the same choice Aaron had faced: stay and become part of the forest's hungry collection, or leave and doom Hannah to that fate. "There has to be another way," he said, though he was no longer sure who he was talking to. "There isn't." Hannah's voice was gentle now, almost kind. "The forest is old, Ranger Hayes. Older than human ethics or logic or fairness. It existed before we arrived, and it'll exist after we're gone. It has rules, and those rules don't care about our sense of justice. My father will grieve. Your wife will grieve. Your daughter will grow up with a hole where her father should be. That's tragic and unfair and inevitable, because you're not leaving here alone. Then neither of us leaves. We both stay. Break the pattern." Hannah smiled sadly. "That's not how it works. One stays, one goes. Always. The forest needs the exchange, needs the sacrifice to maintain the boundary, to keep what's in the hollow from spreading further. That's what the loggers finally understood. They stayed willingly, gave themselves up to seal the breach they'd created. And it's working so well," Chris said bitterly. "The containment's failing, you said so yourself. In another few years, what? It spreads to the visitor center, to the highway, to Port Angeles." "Maybe, probably." Hannah looked at the structure, at the shadows gathering around it. "But a few years is better than immediately. And if someone maintains the boundary, performs the ritual correctly, maybe it lasts another century. Maybe 2. long enough for someone smarter than us to find a permanent solution. Chris's radio crackled suddenly, Sarah's voice cutting through. "Chris, we're getting seismic readings from your area. Small tremors, very localized. What's happening out there?" He looked at the structure, at the way the ground around it was beginning to crack, fissures spreading outward like a spider web. Through the gaps, he could see something moving. Not roots, not water, but something that existed in the spaces between matter, something that wanted out. "Sarah," he said carefully, "I need you to expand the closure order. 5-mile radius from my current position. No one enters this area under any circumstances. And I need you to get me access to the original Matheson camp reports. The real ones, not the sanitized versions. There's a containment procedure, something the loggers did. I need to know what it was." "Chris, we're sending the team in now. Just hold position and—" "No." The force of his response surprised even him. "You cannot send anyone else in here. The team, the helicopter, nobody. This area is contaminated." He chose the word deliberately, knowing it would trigger emergency protocols. Dangerous atmospheric conditions, possible toxic exposure. "I'm following hazmat procedures and establishing a quarantine perimeter." "What the hell are you talking about? There's no industrial activity out there, no." "Just trust me, Sarah, please. Keep everyone back, I'll explain when I can, but right now I need those records and I need you to promise me that no one crosses into this area until I give the all clear." A long pause. Okay, Chris. I'll get you the records, but if you're not back by 1800 hours, I'm coming in personally. Protocols be damned." "Understood." He ended the transmission and turned to Hannah. "Tell me everything. The exact procedure. What the loggers did, how they did it, what made it work. Why? You can't recreate it. It requires 23 people, 1 for each breach point in the containment boundary. That's why they all died. They each had to anchor a specific location, physically and spiritually, I guess. Their deaths, their souls, whatever you want to call it, they became part of the seal. And even then it's been degrading. 91 years and it's almost gone. But it held for 91 years. That means it's possible to reinforce it. Not with 2 people. The math doesn't work. The geometry doesn't work. The metaphysics, if that's even the right word, don't work." Chris pulled out his notebook, the one he'd been writing in since the first call from Mitchell. "Talk me through it anyway. Every detail. Hannah, you're an anthropologist, you studied this, you must have theories about the mechanism, about why it worked." She stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay, yes. The structure isn't random. It's based on sacred geometry, specifically patterns found in indigenous containment rituals from this region. The Quinault, the Quileute, the Ho, they all had stories about hollow places in the forest, gaps in the world where things could slip through. They had procedures for sealing those gaps, and the Matheson loggers, or someone advising them, adapted those procedures. For the next hour, as the shadows grew longer and the structure's presence became harder to ignore, Hannah explained. She drew diagrams in the dirt, showed him the mathematical relationships between the marker positions, explained the significance of the tools mounted on the posts, each one representing a different form of binding, a different aspect of the seal. "But here's the key," she said finally. "The loggers didn't just place the posts and perform a ritual, they stayed. They anchored the boundary with their continued presence. That's why their bodies were found scattered. Each one died at a specific location, and each location corresponds to a weakness in the hollow. Their deaths weren't random, they were deliberate sacrifices." "Sacrifices require volition," Chris said. "They chose this. They chose to fix their mistake. They released something they couldn't control, and they paid the price to contain it." Chris looked at his GPS, which was finally stabilizing, showing a single location. He looked at his satellite phone, which now showed 3 bars. The forest was giving him a choice, he realized. A clear path out if he wanted to take it, if he was willing to leave Hannah behind. He thought of Elena, of Maya, of the life he'd built after Aaron's death. Thought of returning home, of trying to explain, of living with the knowledge that he'd abandoned someone to a fate worse than death. Thought of the nightmares that would follow, worse than the ones he already had, because this time he'd known. This time, he'd understood the choice and made it anyway, and he thought of the thing in the hollow, pressing against the weakening boundary, waiting for its chance to spread beyond this forest, to reach the trails where families hiked, the campgrounds where children played, the small towns that bordered the park. "There is another way," he said slowly, the idea forming as he spoke. Not traditional, not sane, probably, but possible. What way? The containment requires anchors, specific points that tie the boundary to physical reality. The loggers provided 23. But what if we don't need that many? What if we can compensate for numbers with intensity, with knowledge, with... He struggled for the right word. With purpose. I don't understand. The loggers didn't know what they were doing. They were following instructions, improvising, trying to fix a problem they barely comprehended. But you've studied this. You understand the theory, the geometry, the cultural significance. And He stopped, confronting a truth he'd avoided for 6 years. I've been touched by this place. Aaron's death marked me somehow. I can hear the voices, I can see the shadows. I'm already partially here, already part of the resonance. You're talking about voluntary anchoring, creating a new seal with just the two of us. Hannah's eyes widened. Chris, that's insane. The energy required, the psychic toll. We'd have to be strong enough to hold the boundary against something that killed 23 men even after they died for it. I know. You'd never see your family again. Never see daylight again. You'd exist in a liminal state, aware but not alive, holding back something incomprehensible for, I don't even know how long. Decades, centuries. I know, and even if it works, even if we somehow generate enough force to reinforce the boundary, eventually it'll fail. All containment fails. The next person who comes looking, the next researcher who gets too curious, they'll weaken it again. And what we're about to do, assuming we survive it, will become just another story, another legend that future rangers tell themselves isn't quite real. I know, Chris said for the third time. But it buys time. It keeps your father from burying a daughter. It keeps my daughter from growing up without a father. He stopped, corrected himself. From knowing her father died for a reason. And maybe, if we're lucky, it buys enough time for someone to find a permanent solution. Hannah looked at him for a long moment, then at the structure, then back at him. You understand this is worse than death, right? Death is an ending. This is suspension. Eternal vigilance against something that will never stop trying to break free. Yes, and you still want to do it? Chris thought of Aaron, of all the questions he'd never been able to answer, all the guilt he'd carried for failing to prevent something he hadn't understood. This was the answer. Not redemption, he didn't believe in that, but completion, understanding, the chance to face what had killed his partner and say, not again, not on my watch. Tell me the procedure, he said. They worked quickly, urgently, racing against the tremors that were coming more frequently now, against the fissures spreading through the earth, against the shadows that pressed ever closer to the clearing's edge. Hannah drew symbols in the dirt while Chris collected stones, branches, anything that could serve as anchor points. They didn't have the loggers' time, their numbers, their preparation. They had desperation and knowledge, and a shared understanding that some sacrifices were necessary. At 2:17 p.m., and Chris noted the time with grim recognition, they stood at opposite ends of the clearing, Hannah at the north point, Chris at the south. The structure pulsed between them, its geometry becoming more visible, more wrong, as the boundary weakened. There's no guarantee this works, Hannah called across the space. We might die. We might survive but fail. We might succeed and wish we died. I know. Your last chance to run, Ranger Hayes. Chris looked at his hands, at the wedding ring he'd promised Elena he'd never remove, at the watch Maya had given him for his last birthday. He thought of the life he was choosing to leave, the future he was trading for an eternal present. And he thought of the thing in the hollow, patient and hungry and waiting. "I'm not running," he said. "Not this time." They began. The words Hannah had taught him felt foreign in his mouth, syllables from languages that had been old when the first humans walked this continent. But he spoke them anyway, focusing his intention, his will, his entire self into the act of binding. He felt the boundary respond, felt it recognize his presence, his purpose. And then he felt the forest take him. It wasn't painful, not exactly. More like sinking, like diving into water that was also time, also memory, also possibility. He felt himself stretching, thinning, becoming distributed across the boundary like paint across canvas. He felt Hannah doing the same on the other side of the clearing, their consciousnesses interweaving with the structure itself, with the posts and symbols and the trapped echoes of 23 dead loggers who nodded in recognition as Chris passed through their space. "Welcome," they seemed to say. "Welcome to the watch. Welcome to the work that never ends." And beneath them, below the boundary inside the hollow, Chris felt the things that wanted out. They were vast and cold and utterly alien, intelligences that had existed in the spaces between reality for ages that made human history seem like a heartbeat. They pressed against the renewed seal, testing it, probing for weaknesses. But the seal held. Chris didn't know how long he existed in that state of suspension. Time had become something negotiable, something that flowed in multiple directions simultaneously. But gradually, he became aware of a change. The pressure from below was lessening. The tremors were stopping. The fissures in the earth were closing, the shadows retreating, the impossible geometry of the structure becoming less aggressive. They'd done it. Against all probability, against reason, they'd reinforced the containment, and the price was everything. Chris tried to open his eyes to return to his body, to become physical again. But there was no body to return to. He existed now as a function of the boundary itself, aware but not alive, present but not physical. He could sense the forest around him, could feel the presence of hikers miles away, could hear Sarah on the radio calling his name, and he could sense Hannah, intertwined with him in the seal, sharing this new existence. Is this what it's like for them? She thought, and he understood she meant the loggers, the eternal watchers. Forever? Or something like it. Yes, he thought back. This is the price. Was it worth it? Chris considered. From this new perspective, he could see the thing in the hollow clearly, could understand what it was and what it would have done if released, could see the threads of possibility spreading outward from this moment, the people it would have touched, the reality it would have corrupted, the slow infection that would have spread through the forest and beyond. Ask me in 100 years, he thought. We won't last that long. The seal is strong now, but it'll degrade. Everything does. Then we'll do what the loggers did. We'll hold as long as we can. And maybe someone else will come. Maybe someone will figure out how to end this permanently. You're an optimist. I'm a father. Optimism is part of the job description. He felt Hannah's amusement, sharp and bittersweet, then felt it fade as they both settled into the work. The eternal vigilance, the constant pressure of holding back something that would never stop trying to break free. In the physical world, Sarah Kim found Chris's gear at the clearing's edge. His radio, his GPS, his satellite phone, all functioning perfectly. But no sign of Chris himself, and no sign of Hannah Mitchell. The search continued for 2 weeks, involving hundreds of personnel, dogs, helicopters, thermal imaging. They found nothing. Eventually, the case was classified as a double disappearance, added to the list of mysteries that Olympic National Park accumulated over decades. Raymond Mitchell buried an empty coffin and tried to accept that some questions had no answers. Elena Hayes explained to 7-year-old Maya that sometimes Daddy's job was dangerous, that sometimes people didn't come home, that love didn't end even when presence did. And in the forest, in a clearing that slowly vanished from maps and memory, 2 watchers maintained their vigil. They would hold the boundary as long as they could. These 2 who'd chosen suspension over escape, service over survival. They would hold until they couldn't anymore, until the seal failed again and demanded new anchors. But that was a problem for another day, another year, another century. For now, they held. And the things in the hollow, patient and hungry and eternal, pressed against the renewed seal and waited for time to do what it always did: weaken, erode, fail. But not today. Thanks for reading to the end. If you enjoyed this narrative, consider following for more immersive stories. What's your interpretation of Hannah's fate and the collective's nature? I'd love to read your theories in the comments.